They wore crowns, commanded empires, and shaped history, but behind the silken steel were bodies that betrayed them, club feet hidden by thrones, minds unraveling behind royal decrees. Eyes that couldn't see, arms that couldn't lift a sword, faces warped by bloodlines too pure for survival. These were the rulers history polished, but we're peeling back the velvet. This is not a story of power. It's a story of the pain they tried to hide. These are 30 royals with secret disabilities and deformities, rewriting the myth of kingship, one broken body at a time. Before we dive into these buried truths, make sure you're subscribed for more deep cuts into the darkest corners of history. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? Dawn in Dublin? Let's see who else is wandering the past with us tonight. Tutankhamun. By the time British archaeologist Howard Carter chipped open the sealed doorway to the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, Egypt had already swallowed his name for over 3 millennia. And yet, within moments of that tomb's breach, the boy king would become immortal. Gold, masks, curses, museums. Tutankhamun was reborn as a glittering enigma of youth and majesty. But what Carter didn't dig up, what no newspaper breathlessly reported amid the pharaoh's cascades of treasure, was the king's crooked left foot, his club foot to be precise, or the dead bone tissue in his femur, or the dozens of canes buried with him, not royal scepters, but walking sticks, ornate, yes, bejeweled, yes, but medical unmistakably. Tutankhamun wasn't just the boy who ruled Egypt, he was the boy who limped through it. When he ascended the throne at around 9 years old, Egypt was in ideological chaos. His predecessor and likely father Akhenaten had upended centuries of polytheistic tradition by installing the worship of a single deity, Aten, the sun disk. The gods were ousted, the temples emptied, the priests silenced. It was monotheistic revolution in an empire built on ritual multiplicity. Tutankhamun's reign was, at least officially, the return to normalcy. He moved the capital back to Thebes. He reinstated the old gods. His new name, Tutankhamun, literally meant living image of Amun, a deliberate reversal of his birth name, Tutankhaten. But while religious statues were rising again, the boy himself was breaking down. Evidence from his mummy paints a picture that no temple inscription would dare carve. A congenital clubfoot twisted his left leg inward. The bones in that leg were thin, underused. His right foot had traces of curler disease, a condition where the navicular bone in the foot dies due to interrupted blood supply. On top of that, a broken thigh bone, possibly the result of a fall shortly before death. All this in a body already weakened by malaria, genetic inbreeding, and a cleft palate. In short, Tutankhamun was more fragile than the kingdom he inherited. And yet, you'd never guess it from his official portraits. Ancient Egyptian art wasn't journalism, it was propaganda. Pharaohs weren't drawn with disabilities. They were idealized, symmetrical, godlike. Tutankhamun is shown smiting enemies, seated regally, or striding into eternity, never limping, never leaning, never failing. The canes in his tomb, more than 130 of them, tell a quieter story. Some showed signs of heavy use, others were ceremonial. All of them, in their mute abundance, whisper the same truth. Tutankhamun needed help to stand. And that help didn't end with canes. His burial chamber included orthopedic-style sandals, wide, flat, and made for someone who couldn't walk easily. His ornate golden throne, while impressive, may have functioned more like a medical chair than a symbol of leisure. Everything around him, from his footwear to his furniture, seems to have been adapted for a body in decline. The irony? For decades, The world treated Tutankhamun as the picture of youthful perfection. He was the boy king, the dazzling child monarch, the teenage pharaoh frozen in time. His golden mask, smooth and symmetrical, became a global icon. Even in death, the mask carried the lie forward. The real face beneath it had a slightly elongated skull, protruding front teeth, and a pronounced overbite. And the mask? It didn't even fit properly. It may have been made for someone else. Historians now believe that Tutankhamun was the product of incest, likely the child of Akhenaten and his own sister. DNA studies from 2010 confirmed genetic markers that pointed toward this royal inbreeding, a common but perilous tradition in dynastic Egypt. The result wasn't just a limited gene pool, it was physical vulnerability, manifest in brittle bones, immune weakness, and possibly even cognitive difficulties. But again, no Staley says that. No hymn laments the pharaoh's limp. No monument admits he could barely walk. His disability was his secret, one buried in silence, until the 20th century peeled the gold off the lie. The sheer extremity of the disconnect between Tutankhamun's lived body and his immortal image is part of why his story endures. He wasn't just a royal with a medical condition. He was the very embodiment of image management, of disability erased by divinity, of pain hidden beneath protocol, of a young man crowned with power he could barely stand under literally. And perhaps that's the most devastating part. Tutankhamun reigned for roughly 9 years before dying at around 18 or 19. His death was abrupt. The cause is still debated. Infection from a broken leg? Complications from malaria, a fatal cocktail of ailments inherited from a broken gene pool? We may never know. What we do know is that when Carter unearthed him, he found a boy buried in gold, but broken beneath it. A body wrapped in gauze and denial. A legacy polished to a shine so blinding, it took a century of medical scanning and historical digging just to admit he couldn't walk without help. He was the sun god's chosen, the restorer of divine order, and he needed a cane just to take a step. But Tutankhamun's life wasn't just about masking disability, it was about dynasty, and for that, we don't have to look far. Because the same family that crowned a limping boy would soon put a twisted-footed teenager on the throne again. Different pharaoh, same bloodline, same deformity. Enter Siptah. Siptah's name doesn't sparkle like Tutankhamun's. No gold mask, no London exhibits, no curse-heavy headlines. But in some ways, his story is even more haunting, because while Tutankhamun's body bore the slow decay of royal inbreeding and a life stitched together by court caretakers, Siptah was the product of a political void. And into that void, a teenager with a twisted foot was shoved, propped up by advisors, polished by propaganda, and ultimately buried beneath the weight of a collapsing dynasty. When Siptah took the throne, Egypt was spiraling. He ruled during the tail end of the 19th dynasty, a dynasty already in freefall. His predecessor, Seti II, had barely held on to power. The throne was being clawed at by multiple factions. The divine order of the pharaohs, that smooth and invincible facade, was cracking like dried mud. What did the empire do? They crowned a club-footed boy. Like Tutankhamun before him, Siptah was a child pharaoh. Likely around 10 years old when he took the throne, his ascension was orchestrated by powerful players, particularly Bey, the infamous chancellor of Syrian origin who rose from foreign obscurity to political puppeteer. It was Bey who likely engineered Siptah's elevation. And it was Bey, too, who would later be executed for overreaching his influence. But in the meantime, Siptah sat on the throne. Or rather, he was placed on it. He wasn't supposed to be king. His lineage was muddy, Some scholars speculate he was the son of Seti II. Others argue he might have been illegitimate or born to a minor wife. Regardless, what's certain is this: the boy had a foot that didn't work. A club foot, almost certainly congenital. Some theories even suggest it could have been polio. Either way, he could not walk properly. And that meant the throne he inherited, the throne of the living Horus, had to bend to accommodate a crooked gait. But if you look at the reliefs carved during Siptah's reign, you wouldn't know. In one of his better-known representations, he's depicted performing the classic smiting pose, arm raised, enemy underfoot, power in full display. But here's the quiet lie: Siptah couldn't physically take that stance. He wouldn't have been able to plant one foot in front of the other in triumph. His legs didn't work like that. The artists knew this. The priests knew it. Hell, maybe even Siptah knew it. But the image had to be maintained. And so, the deformity was buried in stone just as surely as it would be buried in sand after his death. Unlike Tutankhamun, Siptah's tomb wasn't a glorious chamber of gold. It was left incomplete. KV 47-inch The Valley of the Kings is rough, undecorated in parts, and gives the impression of haste and neglect. The boy king died young, around 16, maybe 17. The cause? Unknown. Maybe an infection, maybe a complication of his condition. What's painfully clear is that he never fully ruled. His voice was never truly his own. Instead, others ruled in his name. The regent was Tawazret, the widow of Seti II, who later claimed the throne herself. Alongside her was Bey, until his execution for treason. Siptah's reign was not so much a rule as it was a placeholder. His disability made him malleable, controllable, a perfect figurehead for a power-hungry court. He couldn't lead a battle. He couldn't enforce his will physically. His impairment wasn't just a medical issue, it was political currency. Yet it's easy to forget that he was also just a boy. Imagine this: a teenager with a painful, twisted foot, dressed in the regalia of gods, paraded through temples, made to speak divine words while hobbling behind priests. He likely suffered constant pain. There were no orthopedic shoes in ancient Egypt, no painkillers, no medical understanding of neurodegeneration or skeletal defects, and still, he had to appear divine. This is what makes his story extreme, not just the disability itself, but the architecture of denial around it. His body was broken, his power was borrowed, his legacy was buried. Even in death, Siptah was an afterthought. His tomb's walls are sparsely decorated compared to the elaborate pictorial narratives of his royal predecessors. His name was erased in parts. Later, pharaohs saw his reign and his lineage as inconvenient, politically embarrassing, historically skippable. He had no great monuments, no temples in his name, no fanfare, just a small, twisted foot and the heavy crown of a dying dynasty. And still, there's something chilling about him. And because the imagery continued, even as the empire collapsed around him, even as political murder and court intrigue consumed his regents, even as his own body failed him, the iconography marched on. Pharaoh smiting, Pharaoh hunting, Pharaoh erect and powerful. The art lied for him, just as it had for Tutankhamun, just as it would lie for generations of royals to come. And if you think Egypt was alone in that, think again. Because the next pharaoh didn't just bend the image, he shattered it. He didn't limp or hide behind advisors. He made himself strange on purpose, elongated, androgynous, divine in a way no one had seen before. His name was Akhenaten. And his body? That's where the story gets weird. Akhenaten. Before he was Akhenaten, he was Amenhotep IV, a name so conventional it barely ruffled the linen. But sometime in the early years of his reign, he shed that name like a skin and took up a new one, Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. And with that single act, he began the most radical religious revolution Egypt had ever seen. He also, possibly, put his own body on display not as a symbol of perfection, but as something else, something strange, something distorted, something real? Let's back up. Akhenaten ruled during the 18th dynasty, at the peak of Egypt's imperial glory. He was the father, or at least the predecessor, of Tutankhamun. But where his son, or nephew, or possibly younger brother, depending on which scholarly debate you dive into, would be remembered for his burial bling, Akhenaten is remembered for burning down the old gods. He replaced the pantheon of Egypt gods with animal heads, long traditions, priestly networks, vast temple economies with a single disk of light. The Aten. No face, no mythology, just the sun itself. He closed temples, fired priests, built a new capital at Amarna from scratch, and in its newly chiseled walls, we start to see something bizarre. Akhenaten doesn't look like any other pharaoh. His depictions in art are, to put it mildly, biologically improbable. His skull is elongated, his jaw is narrow and sharp, his lips are full, his limbs are spindly. His torso is soft, with what some describe as gynecomastia breast development. His hips are wide. His belly is distended. He is drawn neither as a virile warrior nor as a perfectly symmetrical deity. He is drawn like a question mark. Art historians and scholars have debated this body for decades. Was it purely symbolic, a visual metaphor for the androgynous Aten, the creator of all genders? Or was this how Akhenaten actually looked? The latter theory opens a door into a darker, more clinical speculation. Some believe Akhenaten may have had a genetic disorder, Marfan syndrome for example, which can result in elongated limbs, flexible joints, and heart problems. Others propose Froelich syndrome, hypothalamic dysfunction, or Klinefelter syndrome, or even multiple congenital disorders at once. The trouble is, we don't have his confirmed remains. A skull was once thought to be his, but DNA and context haven't confirmed it, so the theories remain, like sand swirling in the desert wind, unproven but persistent. Here's what we do know. Akhenaten was one of the few pharaohs to depict himself as vulnerable, even tender. He's shown kissing his daughters, cradling them, sitting with them on his lap while sunlight pours down like fingers from the Aten. He is not the smiting king, the lion slayer, the warlord. He's soft, human, intimate. It's as if his whole reign was a rejection not just of religious orthodoxy, but of masculine performance itself. But then the propaganda paradox kicks in. What if this authenticity was just another mask? Because while Akhenaten may have looked unorthodox in stone, he still ruled with an iron solar fist. His religious reforms weren't suggestions, they were mandates. Worship of the Aten became state policy. Dissenters were erased from monuments, temples were ransacked, even the great name of Amun, once the king of the gods, was chiseled off inscriptions like a profanity. Akhenaten made himself the sole prophet of the Aten. No priests, no intermediaries, just him. And that kind of singular divine access doesn't leave much room for personal weakness. So if his art showed deformity, or let's call it difference, was that brave realism? Or was it an assertion of divine uniqueness? After all, to the ancient Egyptian mind, being physically different wasn't necessarily bad. If your body looked unlike any other human's, maybe that meant you weren't just human. Maybe you were something more. So picture it, a ruler with possibly real medical conditions, elongated features, feminized body shape, odd posture, presenting those very traits as holy. Not hidden, not minimized, not gilded into a lie, but exaggerated, sculpted, broadcast on temple walls for all to see. It was a revolutionary inversion of royal image-making. If most pharaohs had tried to look perfect despite imperfection, Akhenaten might have leaned into the imperfection as a badge of divinity. You couldn't question him. He wasn't human like you. He was a living embodiment of the Aten. Who cares if he had a curved spine or brittle bones? His bones were made of sunlight. Of course, the backlash was biblical. After his death, Egypt snapped back. Hard. The old gods returned with a vengeance. His city was abandoned. His statues were smashed. His name was excised from official king lists. The boy pharaoh who followed Tutankhamun was part of this counter-reformation, restoring Amun and trying to erase the strange reign of his predecessor. But the image of Akhenaten lingers. There's something undeniably eerie about a king who might have had a real, visible disorder and who used it to craft a new divine persona. He didn't just tolerate difference, he weaponized it. He became a living question mark. Was he sick or sacred? Was he suffering or sanctified? We may never know, but one thing is certain. In a world where kings were supposed to be muscular, symmetrical, eternally young, Akhenaten chose to look alien. And in doing so, he cracked the image of the pharaoh wide open. But not everyone had that luxury. Not every king could turn their defect into divinity. Some had to mask it, bury it, force the world to look away. And for one man, it wasn't just a scar or a limp. It was right on his face. Next, the sultan with the eye no one was supposed to see, Baybars. Baybars was not born a king. He was not an heir. He had no bloodline stretching through the thrones of Egypt or Syria. In fact, he wasn't even born free. He entered the world on the fringes of the Eurasian steppe, likely in Kipchak territory, and was sold into slavery. Dragged into the Mamluk military machine, raised through violence, discipline, and blood. Baybars rose from a slave to sultan. It's the kind of trajectory that reads like epic fiction until you remember the eye. Because Baybars had a flaw. A visible one. A physical defect on his face. The accounts vary slightly. Some say he had a cataract, others describe a milky haze or a distorted shape, but the consensus is clear. One of his eyes was damaged. It didn't function. It didn't look normal. It marked him. And for a long time, it nearly stopped him. In the Mamluk world, military excellence wasn't enough. Your body was your resume. Physical perfection was tied to divine favor, legitimacy, power. Defects were liabilities. Disabilities were disqualifications. For someone like Baybars, whose entire rise depended on appearances, on commanding men, on dominating rooms, on projecting invincibility, that single eye was a glaring vulnerability. It nearly cost him everything. According to multiple sources, Baybars was once rejected for high command, specifically because of his eye. Not because he lacked talent, he had it in spades. He was a battlefield genius. But the court couldn't stomach the idea of a visibly blemished man as sultan. How could a man with a damaged eye see the will of God? How could he judge, lead, rule? But history, as it so often does, bent under pressure. Because Baybars refused to go away, he kept winning, and winning, and winning. He was instrumental in one of the most seismic military events of the 13th century, the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. The Mongols, unstoppable, relentless, mythically terrifying, were pushing west. No force had resisted them effectively, until the Mamluks did. Until Baybars did. It was his tactics, his ambushes, his feigned retreats, his logistical precision that broke the Mongol line. That made the Mongol war machine stutter for the first time. That turned back the tide. And suddenly, the eye didn't matter so much. Victory washed away blemishes. Power blurred imperfections. And in the aftermath of that triumph, Baybars moved decisively. A political vacuum opened. He filled it. He became sultan, not just a general or a regent, but the undisputed ruler of Egypt and Syria. But make no mistake, the eye didn't vanish. It didn't heal. It didn't get written out of the story. It just got hidden. Images of Baybars are rare, but when he is depicted on coins, in manuscripts, his face is stylized, clean, symmetrical, normal. His eye, that flaw which had once nearly blocked his ascent, is scrubbed clean from the record. The Mamluk court, for all its meritocratic brutalism, still required its rulers to look the part, and a sultan's face was public property. So, the damaged eye was erased by artists, or minimized, or simply never acknowledged. It became a phantom, the thing everyone knew about but never depicted. And yet, in his life, Baybars owned it. Because here's the twist. He didn't pretend to be flawless. He didn't lock himself in a tower or wear a veil. He ruled openly, publicly. He faced his enemies, his court, his people eye and all. There's something undeniably brutal about that. He leaned into the same contradiction that would plague so many royals with physical differences. The defect that had once made him weak became proof of his strength. It was a scar, yes, but a scar worn like armor. He had fought, he had bled, he had been underestimated, and now he ruled. Baybars didn't just rule, he transformed the very empire he inherited. He purged the remaining Crusader strongholds along the Levantine coast. He wove a vast spy network across his territories. He standardized Islamic jurisprudence. He built mosques, madrasas, hospitals. He laid the institutional foundation of a Mamluk state that would endure for centuries. He was a visionary in armor, a monster to his enemies, a machine to his admirers. But the eye always remained in the corner of the story, the unspoken asterisk, the detail no chronicler could quite ignore. And here's what makes his case extreme, the contrast. Unlike European monarchs who hid deformities behind ceremony and divine right, Baybars couldn't afford to hide. He wasn't born into a system that would protect him. He had to fight for every inch. He had to bleed for his legitimacy. And his disability, however minor or cosmetic it may seem, was a genuine obstacle. A scarlet mark in a world that worshipped physical dominance. And yet, he broke through. He became a one-eyed sultan in a world that believed both eyes were necessary to see God's justice. That contradiction, public power, private flaw would repeat again and again in royal history. But Baybars was one of the earliest to twist it to his advantage. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He demanded loyalty. And he got it. But while Baybars wore his eye like a buried weapon, the next man wore his wounds in plain sight. His limp was legendary. His arm was withered. His enemies called him the lame. His empire, however, called him master. Next, Timur. He was called Timur the Lame, but not to his face. To his enemies, he was terror incarnate, a storm in human form, the scourge of Asia, the man who built towers out of skulls and cities out of conquest. To his followers, he was Amir Timur, Sahib Kiran, the lord of the auspicious conjunction, the sword of Islam, the unshakable ruler of one of the largest empires ever assembled by a single individual. But behind all the titles, all the thunder and fire, Timur had a secret baked into his very name. He was physically broken. Timur was born in the 14th century in the region around modern-day Uzbekistan. He came from the Barlas tribe, a Turkicized Mongol group, and he rose through the swirling chaos left behind by the collapse of the Mongol Empire. The region was fractured, feudal, desperate for a unifier or ripe for a predator. Timur became both. And yet, he started with a limp. He was wounded in youth, possibly shot in the leg and hand during a raid or skirmish. The result was a damaged right leg that left him with a permanent limp and a withered right arm. The details are murky, but the physical effects were unmistakable. One leg dragged, one arm hung limp. His enemies latched onto this immediately. They called him Timuri Lang, Timur the Lame. It was meant as an insult, a diminishment, a way to mock a man they feared. But if they thought the nickname would humiliate him, they didn't understand Timur. He turned it into a legend. See, in the world Timur inherited, power was tied to martial prowess, charisma, visibility. Your body was a battlefield, and Timur's bore the scars. He wasn't born into royalty. He had no divine right. What he had was ambition and the brutality to back it up. And if his body bore damage, so be it. He weaponized that too. The limp became part of the myth. The withered arm didn't prevent him from leading charges, designing campaigns, or executing siege strategies with surgical cruelty. If anything, his impairments made his survival all the more terrifying. How dangerous must a man be to conquer half of Asia, dragging 1 foot behind him? And conquer he did. From the Caucasus to Delhi, from the Caspian to Damascus, Timur carved a blood-soaked path across the medieval world. He sacked Aleppo, razed Baghdad, burned Delhi. He defeated the Ottomans at Ankara, captured their sultan, and paraded him in a cage. He invaded Persia, crushed the Golden Horde, and harried China before death claimed him mid-campaign. He was unstoppable. And yet, behind every campaign, every victory, was a man who limped. He masked the weakness not by hiding it, but by flooding the world with fear. Timur wasn't subtle. His style was performative terror. After sacking a city, he often built pyramids of severed heads, up to 90,000 skulls in a single monument after the conquest of Baghdad. His messages were etched in annihilation. He didn't need you to see him limp. He needed you to see what he could do while limping. But not everyone around him ignored the deformity. There are stories, some apocryphal, others more credible, of emissaries noting Timur's body, his walk, his hand, even his teeth. And yet, none dared mock him to his face. His coat projected power so thickly that physical weakness became irrelevant, or rather, it became part of the awe. The message was clear. If this is what a broken man can do, imagine what he would be at full strength. But the image wasn't entirely raw. Like all royals, especially those who rose by force, Timur controlled how he was seen. Court artists depicted him seated, robed, symmetrical. There are few clear contemporary portraits of him, and most of the later images, especially those minted on coins or painted in Persian miniatures, show a dignified, aging warrior with no visible trace of impairment. The limp, the arm, it disappears into the folds of time. Only the name, the lame, lingers like a ghost in the imperial archive. And yet, his legacy is not only in the blood he spilled, but in the contradictions he embodied. He was a devout Muslim who destroyed Islamic cities, a patron of art who decimated cultural capitals, a military genius who couldn't even walk straight. His empire collapsed after his death, his sons squabbled, his conquests unraveled, but the shadow of Timur lingered across Central Asia for centuries. The Timurid dynasty, born of his blood, would pave the way for the Mughal Empire. His descendant Babur would take his legacy into India, establishing a lineage that would rule for hundreds of years. And even today, in places like Uzbekistan, Timur is revered as a national hero. Statues of him stand tall, his limp largely forgotten. But that limp, it mattered. It mattered because it was real, it was visible, and in a world of warrior kings, Timur rose to rule not in spite of his disability, but through it. He didn't hide it, he conquered with it. And if Timur's scars were worn on his body, the next ruler bore his pain in swelling joints and collapsing flesh. His kingdom was vast, his court ornate. His condition, gout so severe, it left him barely able to stand. Next, the emperor who turned gluttony into ceremony, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was not merely a ruler. He was a collision between Mongol nomadism and Chinese bureaucracy, between explosive conquest and meticulous governance, between the horse lord and the emperor. Grandson of Genghis Khan, he was heir to an empire carved by hooves and fire. But where Genghis was the whirlwind, Kublai was the weight. Heavy, permanent, inevitable, and eventually, literally immobile. The man who once hunted across the steppes, who rode with the fury of 1,000 banners, would end his days unable to walk, swollen with gout and obesity, bloated not just by his flesh, but by the sheer size of his dominion. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When Kublai first entered the political stage, the Mongol Empire was the largest land empire in history, but also fractured, teetering, hungry for leadership that could tame chaos without smothering conquest. Kublai wasn't the obvious choice. His older brother Mungke had inherited the Great Khan title. Kublai had to prove himself. And he did first as governor in northern China, then as a master of strategy, culture, and diplomacy. He was the rare Mongol who read Chinese poetry, who built Buddhist temples, who could drink kumis from a horse-skin flask at dawn and attend Confucian court rituals by dusk. He became Great Khan in 1260, but he didn't stop there. Kublai wanted more than Khanship. He wanted China. Not just its land, but its soul. In 1271, he declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty and crowned himself Emperor of China, breaking with nomadic tradition and fully embracing sedentary imperial rule. It was a bold move. Some Mongol nobles balked, some revolted, but Kublai had power in the armies to prove it. By 1279, the Song dynasty had fallen. For the first time in centuries, all of China was under foreign rule, and Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, sat at the center of it all, on a throne, in a palace, wearing silk. But thrones come with a price. The conqueror's body began to collapse under the burden of the court. As Kublai aged, his health deteriorated rapidly. By his 50s, he was suffering from intense and chronic gout, a disease caused by uric acid buildup in the joints, leading to excruciating pain, inflammation, and swelling. Gout is sometimes called the disease of kings, thanks to its associations with rich diets and heavy drinking. Kublai was certainly guilty of both. The Mongol warlord who once thrived on horse meat and fermented mare's milk now gorged on the finest delicacies of China, endless banquets of fatty meats, rice wines, and sweet confections. His waistline expanded, his mobility declined. His once legendary ability to ride for days across the plains was replaced by the slow, painful shuffle of a man whose joints had turned against him. And this was not just a private affliction. It affected everything: his posture, his presence, his aura. A ruler like Kublai couldn't afford to look weak. So, like many before him, he adapted his image. The emperor was still depicted in grand paintings, throned and serene, His obesity was sometimes stylized into a symbol of abundance and majesty. Ceremonial rituals were adjusted. Audiences were shortened or managed with increasing care. When he could no longer attend key court functions in person, he sent proxies, issued decrees, leaned on the machinery of bureaucracy. But behind the curtain, the man was suffering. Gout isn't just a flare-up condition, it's a grinder. Every step becomes a negotiation. Simple movements turn agonizing. Sleep is broken by searing pain in the feet, the knees, the hands. In a world without effective pain relief, every joint becomes a battlefield. And Kublai wasn't just sick, he was grieving. By the end of his reign, he had lost his wife, Chabi, one of his most trusted advisors, and the political glue of his court. He had lost his heir, Genjin. His military campaigns in Japan and Southeast Asia had ended in humiliating failure. His political enemies within the court were multiplying. His grip on the outer territories of the empire was slipping. Even the Ilkhanate and Chagatai Khanate, the other Mongol-controlled regions, were beginning to ignore his authority. And still, the ceremonies continued. The Yuan court was vast, ornate, suffocating. While the Mongol ideal was mobility, Kublai had institutionalized grandeur. Bureaucrats, eunuchs, Confucian scholars, Tibetan monks all orbited his court like moons around a planet. He built new capitals, Chengdu, Dadu, and Dadu, modern-day Beijing, monuments to his ambition. But these cities, like his body, became harder and harder to move. Kublai ruled from couches, from palanquins, from beds. His orders still carried weight, but his steps no longer did. He grew paranoid, suspicious, burdened, and all the while, the propaganda machine kept churning. Imperial records described him as majestic, wise, sagacious, barely mentioning the flesh pressing into his robes or the red-hot swelling in his joints. His decrees were delivered in calligraphy, not in limps. His power still spanned continents on paper, but his body was anchored to a palace he could barely walk through. There's a strange irony in all this. Kublai Khan had spent his youth chasing power across landscapes that his own grandfather had turned into an empire. And when he finally caught it, when he fused Mongol ferocity with Chinese imperialism, it began to devour him from the inside. Obesity, gout, isolation. He died in 1294, unable to move, embattled by sickness, and watching the edges of his empire fray. And yet, his legacy was monumental. The Yuan dynasty would last nearly a century after his death. The Pax Mongolica he helped cement enabled trade, travel, and cultural exchange across Eurasia. Marco Polo, who visited his court, described him in awestruck terms. A mighty emperor, surrounded by splendor. He didn't mention the gout, or the shuffle, or the swollen knees, because to the outside world, Kublai remained a god in brocade. But beneath that silk was a man trapped in a body, failing under its own weight. And if Kublai Khan's decline was a slow collapse hidden behind grandeur, the next emperor began his reign already diminished, his condition not acquired but congenital. A Japanese monarch, born into divinity, slowly sidelined by a court that couldn't explain why he never quite fit the role. Next, Emperor Taisho. Emperor Taisho. In the rigid choreography of Japan's imperial court, where every bow has a height, every gesture a script, and every word a lineage, the man who became Emperor Taisho was born into a role he would never fully play. Heir to a throne older than any other continuous monarchy in the world, Taisho was destined to rule a Japan surging into the modern era. But from the beginning, something was off. He was born Yoshihito in 1879, son of Emperor Meiji, The monarch who had dragged Japan into the industrial age, shattered the shogunate, and built a modern nation from feudal ash. Meiji was fire and steel. Taisho was something else. At first, the symptoms were brushed aside. Yoshihito was a sickly child, suffering from high fevers and frequent illness. Rumors swirled, but the court remained silent. Japanese emperors were not to be questioned. They were living gods Tenno, and gods do not have developmental disorders. But Yoshihito did. From an early age, it became clear that he struggled with comprehension, with speech, with emotional regulation. He was prone to fatigue and cognitive fog. He found complex social functions overwhelming. In a system where control of body and mind was sacred, Yoshihito's body was clumsy, his thoughts sometimes delayed. Later, scholars would suggest neurological or cognitive impairment, possibly a spectrum disorder, possibly the long-term result of cerebral meningitis. But in Meiji Japan, such diagnoses didn't exist. The court called it delicacy. They began adjusting things quietly. When Yoshihito came of age, he was educated not with the rigorous training given to his father, or later his son, but with a carefully curated regimen, gentle instruction, light reading, supervised exposure to foreign languages. He was never sent to military school like other imperial princes. He was shielded, wrapped in silk and silence. But Japan could only hide its heir for so long. When Emperor Meiji died in 1912, Yoshihito took the throne as Emperor Taisho, and immediately the cracks showed. His enthronement ceremony was held with traditional grandeur, but his public appearances were awkward, often brief. During one event, he attempted to entertain a foreign dignitary by sticking out his tongue. At another, he read a speech from the throne, but forgot the lines midway. The court tried to laugh it off. A quirky monarch, eccentric, harmless. But privately, the imperial household panicked. This was not how a Tenno behaved. The Taisho era had begun, but the emperor himself was receding. By 1919, just 7 years into his reign, it was clear that Taisho could not function as a ruler. His cognitive decline had worsened. He was withdrawn, uncommunicative. His grasp of state affairs was minimal. Behind the brocade walls of the imperial palace, advisors began to act on his behalf. His son, Crown Prince Hirohito, was named regent in 1921. That's when the emperor disappeared, not from life, but from view. He was rarely seen in public again. He made no further speeches, attended no major diplomatic events. Portraits of him were tightly controlled. The official imperial photographers were given strict orders. No candid shots, no signs of distress, no deviations from the divine mask. The image had to hold. And it did, mostly thanks to the court's careful management and the relative peace of the Taisho period. Politically, Japan was entering a new phase. The era would later be dubbed Taisho democracy, marked by a blossoming of political parties, civil rights movements, and social modernization. But none of that had anything to do with the man whose era bore the name. Taisho was a ghost emperor. He drifted through the imperial calendar, occasionally appearing on balconies, waving with mechanical formality. His health continued to decline physically as well as mentally. By the late 1922, he was bedridden. When he died in 1926, it was almost a relief to the court, to the bureaucracy, to the narrative machine that could now pivot. Official records never mentioned illness, no disability, no cognitive impairment. Just the standard euphemisms. He bore the burdens of the chrysanthemum throne with great dignity, or his health made personal appearances limited, nothing that pierced the veil of divinity. But in private, among the imperial family and the political elite, there was no doubt. Taisho had never been fit to rule. His entire reign had been an act of concealment. What makes his stories so stark is that his role wasn't military or merely ceremonial. He was, at least nominally, the head of a modern state with expanding ambitions. Japan, during his reign, fought World War I on the side of the Allies. It negotiated treaties. It industrialized further. It expanded its empire into parts of China. And yet, its emperor could barely hold a coherent conversation. He wasn't a king in decline. He was a king never fully present. And, unlike many rulers on this list, Taisho didn't acquire his condition through age or injury or war. He was born into it. The system never adapted for him. It simply worked around him like a body moving while one limb stays paralyzed. That's the extremity. A monarchy continuing as if its centerpiece was functioning, while everyone knew it wasn't. The illusion was more important than the reality. And when that illusion finally ended, when Hirohito took over, the empire accelerated into war, into expansion, into infamy. But that's a different story. Taisho was buried with the full rites of a Tenno, his disability wrapped in incense and ritual. His reign was remembered for peace, not paralysis. His face round, bland, benign faded into history's soft focus background. But in the quiet corners of the Imperial Archive, the truth lingers. For 14 years, Japan was ruled in name by a man who could not rule. And that silence would repeat again. Not in a palace, but in a scholarly court. Not through cognitive decline, but failing vision. The next monarch would read laws he could barely see and govern through the haze of encroaching blindness. Sejong the Great, Sejong the Great. In the long scroll of Korean history, few names shine like Sejong. He was the fourth king of the Joseon dynasty, a sovereign whose reign from 1418 to 1450 is often remembered as Korea's golden age. His era gave birth to one of the most radical intellectual movements East Asia had ever seen, culminating in the invention of Hangul, the Korean script that broke the monopoly of the elite and handed literacy to the masses. Science, music, law, agriculture. Sejong wasn't just a king, he was a revolution in a royal robe. But beneath the halo of genius and the chorus of national pride lies a quieter narrative. Sejong the man, Sejong the body, Sejong the slow descent into darkness. By the end of his reign, he was almost completely blind. This wasn't widely known at the time. It couldn't be. Korean kings weren't supposed to be human in that way. They were Confucian paragons, embodiments of cosmic order. The king's body, like his decisions, was meant to be flawless. A blind king? That was a contradiction in terms. How could a man guide a nation if he couldn't even guide himself through his own palace? And so, Sejong's blindness became a royal secret. But the signs were there, flickering between the brushstrokes of official records. As he aged, Sejong began delegating more and more authority to trusted officials, first to ministers, then to his eldest son, and finally to a tight circle of scholars and regents who served as his eyes and hands. It was gradual, systematic, quiet. Blindness doesn't arrive all at once, and Sejong's didn't either. It crept in over years, slowly clouding the vision of a man who had once overseen astronomical innovations, map-making breakthroughs, and precise medical texts. The very tools he had ordered made to observe the heavens could no longer help him read a page. But he didn't stop ruling. That's the part that makes his case extraordinary. Most monarchs on this list receded as their impairments grew. They were sidelined, replaced, hidden behind veils or portraits or regents who ruled in all but name. Sejong refused to disappear. Instead, he governed through intellect, through delegation, through systems he had built precisely to outlive him. His blindness didn't end his reign, it redefined it. Consider this. The invention of Hangul, the Korean phonetic alphabet, came late in his rule, at the very edge of his physical decline. His advisors opposed it. The aristocracy hated it. The scholars scorned it. Why? Because up until then, Korean writing was done in classical Chinese, a language so difficult and elitist that only a small fraction of the population could read it. Literacy was a weapon of the Yangban, the ruling class. Hangul threatened that monopoly. But Sejong pushed it forward anyway. Not by brute force, not by royal decree alone, but by working in secret with a small team of linguists and scholars, his Hall of Worthies, men hand-picked for their brilliance and loyalty. They developed the script with his guidance, his vision, not his physical sight, but his ideological clarity. In a bitter twist, the king who couldn't see was the one who helped the blind read. That's the irony at the heart of Sejong's disability. As his eyes dimmed, his mind only sharpened. He launched projects to improve farming methods. He expanded printing. He reformed the tax code. He issued musical theories still studied today. Even as his court tried to minimize his declining condition, Sejong's output exploded. But let's not romanticize it too much. Blindness is never just a poetic metaphor. It's isolating, disorienting, dangerous, especially in a royal court filled with political intrigue, Confucian rigidity, and the constant threat of rebellion. Every step without sight could be manipulated. Every whispered slander about the ailing king could become a knife in the dark. And yet, the records remain mostly loyal. The annals of the Joseon dynasty meticulous. Near daily records of court life rarely mention Sejong's blindness outright. When they do, it's euphemistic. His Majesty was unwell. His Majesty declined to attend due to fatigue. They say nothing of the man who likely struggled to recognize faces, who could no longer read edicts with his own eyes, who dictated instead of writing. But there are other clues. Royal court rituals began to change. The number of public appearances decreased. When he did appear, it was often flanked by aides. His son began handling official duties as early as the 1442nd, well before Sejong's death in 1450. This wasn't just succession planning, it was necessity. And yet Sejong remained mentally present, issuing some of his most enduring reforms during this period. His blindness didn't subtract from his legacy. If anything, it added to the legend. Because how many monarchs can claim they reshaped the cultural and intellectual identity of a nation while going blind? Sejong never led an army. He never conquered a foreign land. But his reign outlasted borders. His inventions survived dynasties. His alphabet became a tool for liberation, used centuries later by colonized Koreans to preserve their language under Japanese occupation. And none of it was supposed to happen. He wasn't even the original heir. His older brothers stepped aside, and many questioned whether the quiet, scholarly prince had the grit to rule. But Sejong didn't need volume. He had vision, even when his eyes failed him. When he died in 1450, the court gave him the posthumous title Sejong the Great, one of only 2 Korean kings ever to receive that honor. He was mourned not just as a monarch, but as a sage. His blindness, though never publicly acknowledged, had become part of a deeper myth, the king who saw more with his mind than others did with their eyes. But not all monarchs were allowed such grace. For some, a single wound was enough to shift the narrative, to crack the image, to threaten the very legitimacy of the crown. In the next case, it wasn't blindness, but a different kind of ocular loss. A car crash, a shattered lens, and a nation that looked the other way. Next, Bhumibol Adulyadej. Bhumibol Adulyadej. There is perhaps no monarch in modern history more deeply woven into the fabric of his nation than Bhumibol Adulyadej of Thailand. He wasn't just a king. He was the monarch, the living symbol of unity, stability, and quiet reverence across 70 years of power, the longest reign in Thai history. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1946 until his death in 2016, Bhumibol reigned over a country in constant political flux. Coups, constitutions, protests, reforms, restorations through it all. He endured, inscrutable behind dark glasses. But those glasses weren't just for style. They were there to hide the aftermath of a devastating injury, an injury that permanently blinded him in one eye. It happened in 1948 in the city of Lausanne, Switzerland, where the young king had been living while finishing his studies. He was still a relatively new monarch, having assumed the throne after the mysterious death of his older brother, King Ananda Mahidol. The circumstances of Ananda's death, a gunshot wound in the royal palace, were suspicious, scandalous, and never definitively resolved. Bhumibol was thrust into kingship with barely a moment to grieve. Just 2 years later, fate struck again. He was driving a car when it collided with the back of a truck. The crash left him seriously injured. He suffered facial wounds, a concussion, and most dramatically complete blindness in his right eye. The optic nerve had been severed. There was no repair. His face bore the scars for the rest of his life. And yet, the public barely saw the consequences. Because from that moment on, Bhumibol wore his wound like a state secret, behind glasses, behind silence, behind a wall of deference so thick that even mentioning his injury became taboo. This concealment wasn't just vanity, it was political necessity. Thailand's monarchy had long positioned itself as semi-divine. While no longer absolute in power, the royal image remained sacred. To question the king's competence or to hint at human vulnerability was dangerous territory. Under Thailand's lèse-majesté laws, criticism of the monarchy was illegal and heavily punished. So the image had to remain immaculate, unbroken, symmetrical, even if the king wasn't. But unlike many royals who retreated into the palace when their bodies failed them, Bhumibol moved forward, painfully, carefully, but forward nonetheless. He returned to public life after his recovery, albeit with some adjustments. His public appearances became more choreographed, his angles more carefully managed. The dark glasses became his signature at first, a protective shield, then a cultural constant. A simple fashion accessory to some, but to those who knew it was armor. And, through it all, he ruled. Bhumibol didn't govern directly. Thailand was technically a constitutional monarchy, but his influence was immense. He was the spiritual apex of Thai society. His quiet, slow speech was treated with reverence. His visits to rural villages were filmed like sacred pilgrimages. He was presented not just as a monarch, but as a father figure to the nation. He used this image strategically. Throughout his reign, Thailand cycled through nearly 20 different constitutions, endured a dozen military coups, and faced countless political crises. Bhumibol remained above it all, rarely speaking, but when he did, entire governments shifted. A single televised speech could dissolve protest camps or redirect military force. His silence was a kind of thunder. And yet, the injury always lingered out of sight, but never fully gone. It subtly shaped his reign. He became more reserved, more insular. Photographs show a man perpetually behind lenses, rarely expressing emotion. He often carried a camera, framing others even as he concealed himself. His artistic pursuits, photography, music, painting flourished, perhaps in part because the inner world had grown more important than the outer one. There's an irony there. The man who was blind in one eye became the nation's moral compass. A monarch physically impaired yet politically omnipresent. He may not have had full vision, but his gaze was everywhere. And unlike many monarchs whose disabilities weakened their image, Bhumibol's silence and restraint only elevated him. The Thai public came to see him as serene, almost mystical. His injury became part of the royal mystique. No one talked about it, but everyone knew. Because to speak openly of it was to violate the spell. The injury was even airbrushed from history. Official biographies mention the crash briefly, then move on. No lingering on the trauma, no discussion of the long-term consequences. Even as Bhumibol's health worsened in the 2002 diabetes, lung infections, kidney failure, the language remained euphemistic. He was tired, recuperating, temporarily stepping back. Always temporary, always dignified. The spectacle of decline was kept off camera, but the dark glasses were always there. And in that small object, so mundane, so symbolic, you can see the entire weight of royal myth-making. The glasses were not just about hiding the eye. They were about preserving the idea of the all-seeing king, the man who could understand his people even if he couldn't physically see them all. When Bhumibol died in 2016, the country entered mourning as if a god had passed. Millions dressed in black. His funeral was a national event of theatrical grief. The monarchy's future became uncertain. But his legacy remained carefully preserved, including the parts people weren't allowed to mention. Like the car crash. Like the blindness. Like the truth. Because sometimes, the most enduring royal image is built not from what is shown, but from what is hidden. And the next king on our list knew that better than most. He, too, carried a secret. But his wasn't behind glasses. It was in the mind. A short reign, a silent illness, and a throne that passed as quietly as it was inherited. Talal bin Abdullah. Talal bin Abdullah. In the tapestry of Middle Eastern monarchs, King Talal of Jordan is often just a whisper, a brief reign, a transitional figure. A page turned quickly. He ruled for less than 2 years, from 1951 to 1952, and then disappeared behind the palace walls. No great war, no grand reforms, just an abdication and then a vanishing act. But behind that abrupt departure was a storm the kingdom could not name. Talal bin Abdullah was a king with a mind under siege. Officially, the reason for his abdication was health issues. That's the line used in palace communiques, in government statements, in the carefully polished obituaries that followed decades later. But everyone in the palace and many outside it knew what health really meant. Mental illness, and not the kind that could be softened by euphemism or hidden behind ritual. Talal suffered from what was widely believed to be schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, though, given the era and the region's medical understanding, diagnoses were vague, and treatment was even vaguer. What mattered was this: the king of Jordan could no longer rule. Not just politically, but mentally. The throne had become too heavy for a mind at war with itself. It wasn't always this way. Talal was born in 1909, the eldest son of Abdullah I, founder of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. His lineage stretched back to the Prophet Muhammad. His family had weathered the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the turmoil of British Mandate politics, and the violent birth of the modern Middle East. Talal grew up in a world of ambition and instability, raised not just to be a prince, but a survivor. He was educated abroad in Britain at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. He returned a polished officer, fluent in English, trained in modern military tactics, and steeped in Western ideals. He married Zain al-Sharaf, a powerful and intelligent woman, who would later become one of the quiet anchors of Jordanian royal life. When Abdullah I was assassinated in Jerusalem in 1951, Talal took the throne as the kingdom mourned. At first, things seemed stable. Talal wasn't seen as a revolutionary, but he did enact a few meaningful reforms. He oversaw the drafting of a more liberal constitution in 1952, one that emphasized civil rights and limited royal power on paper, at least. But behind closed doors, whispers were growing. He had begun behaving erratically. Palace insiders described mood swings, paranoia, long periods of withdrawal followed by bursts of frenetic energy. Some days he would isolate himself completely. Others he would speak of conspiracies, of plots invisible to all but him. There were rumors of delusions, of voices, of a king who could not sleep. In another time, in another place, this might have remained hidden longer, but the Middle East, in the 1952nd, was an unstable chessboard. The rise of Arab nationalism, the Cold War, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the spectre of coups. Jordan could not afford a king who might suddenly declare war on a ghost or dissolve parliament in a fugue state. And so, the Hashemite family acted. In August 1952, less than 13 months after his coronation, King Talal was declared unfit to rule. The decision was framed with diplomatic language. The king had suffered a nervous breakdown. He was being treated. He was stepping down voluntarily for the good of the nation. Parliament passed the abdication decree with ceremonial solemnity. His son, Hussein, just 16 years old, was named Crown Prince. A regency was installed until he came of age, and then Talal was gone. He was sent into quiet exile, first to Istanbul, then to a sanatorium in Lausanne, Switzerland, the same city where Bhumibol had once lost his eye. In that cold, clinical environment, Jordan's second king lived out the rest of his life as a patient, not a monarch. He died in 1972, having never returned to political life. He was buried in Jordan with royal honours, but without fanfare. The nation had long since moved on. And yet, Talal's story didn't vanish. It remained, half-told, in palace memoirs and royal biographies, in the anecdotes of old ministers and palace staff. And it stands out on this list not just for the nature of his impairment, but for how completely it removed him from power. Talal's mental illness wasn't the kind that could be masked by ceremony or hidden behind a curtain. It couldn't be painted over with idealized portraits or dressed in imperial robes. It interrupted speech. It disrupted cognition. It destabilized trust. It cracked the mirror of monarchical perfection. And yet, what makes his case so compelling is the very human attempt to protect him. Queen Zayn, his wife, remained devoted throughout his exile. She shielded their children from the darkest parts of his illness. She advised young King Hussein during his formative years, steering the kingdom through one of its most delicate transitions. In many ways, she became the de facto monarch during the years between Talal's abdication and Hussein's maturity. And Hussein, for all his later strength as a ruler, carried the memory of his father's collapse like a shadow. It shaped his understanding of power not as a birthright, but as a burden, one that could crack even the most sacred bloodlines. That's the extreme truth behind Talal's reign, not the illness itself, but what it revealed. That monarchy, for all its divine pretensions, is still built on human minds. And human minds can break, even in palaces, even on thrones, even behind layers of tradition and ceremony and silence. And if Talal's mind unravelled in private, the next monarch on our list would face his breakdown in the open. His illness would grip him while in full view of the empire. during a reign marked by military victories, diplomatic negotiations, and paralysis. Next, Menelik II. Menelik II. He was the last emperor to truly terrify the European powers. Menelik II of Ethiopia, a name that echoes with thunder in colonial history, was not merely a king but a storm that humbled an empire. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, his forces crushed the invading Italian army, making Ethiopia the only African nation to decisively defeat a European colonial power in the scramble for Africa. That victory wasn't just military, it was mythic. It made Ethiopia a symbol of black sovereignty, a beacon for Pan-African pride for generations to come. But behind the towering image of Menelik the Conqueror lay a long, painful decline. One not caused by bullets or battles, but by the slow erosion of his body from within. By the end of his reign, Menelik II was paralyzed, unable to speak, his court silently managing his deterioration while the empire he had forged moved forward without him. His mind remained sharp for a time, his will unbending. But the body betrayed it all. Born in 1844, Menelik was baptized Saleh Mariam and spent his early years as a political pawn, held captive by Emperor Tewodros II. He escaped in his 20s, returned to his native Shewa province, and began consolidating power with fire and steel. His ascent was ruthless. He married strategically, expanded aggressively, and forged alliances when necessary, but always on his terms. By the time he crowned himself Emperor of Ethiopia in 1889, Menelik ruled an empire larger than any in Ethiopian history. His modernization projects were ambitious: roads, telegraphs, railways, minting his own coinage. He imported doctors and engineers, opened schools, and even experimented with electricity. He was a feudal monarch, embracing modernity not as a novelty, but as a weapon. And then came Adwa. The Italian government had misinterpreted the Treaty of Wuchale, assuming a clause gave them protectorate rights over Ethiopia. Menelik disagreed vehemently. When negotiations collapsed, Italy invaded. What followed was a campaign that culminated in one of the most humiliating defeats in European military history. At Adwa, Menelik fielded an army over 100,000 strong, supplied with modern rifles and strategic precision. The Italians were overwhelmed. Thousands were killed, captured, or routed. The shock in Europe was seismic. Black African soldiers had not only fought white Europeans, they had annihilated them. Menelik emerged as a Pan-African icon, a monarch whose face was carved into political banners and liberation dreams. His prestige soared. Diplomats came courting. Ethiopia had proven it would not be ruled, it would rule itself. But the tide would shift. In 1906, Menelik suffered the first of a series of devastating strokes. The initial attack left his right side weakened, his speech slurred. At first, he fought through it, still issued orders, still appeared at ceremonies, still signed decrees, though less frequently and with a trembling hand. The court began to adapt, as courts do. Ministers took on more responsibilities. His wife, Empress Tetu Betul, began to exert significant influence, both politically and personally. Then came the second stroke, and the third. By 1909, Menelik was no longer the man who had won at Adwa. He could barely move. His speech was gone. His body, once the vessel of fierce charisma and battlefield command, was now an immobile shell. His right side was paralyzed. He could not eat without assistance. He could not write. He could not sit unassisted. His eyes tracked people with recognition, but conversation became impossible. And yet, no official abdication came. This is where the myth starts to crack. Ethiopia, proud and royal, refused to admit its emperor was incapacitated. Announcements to the public were minimal. The court insisted the emperor was resting. When foreign diplomats asked, they were told he was recovering. Ministers continued to issue edicts in his name. Documents were signed with his seal, though it's doubtful he understood them. His absence from public ceremonies became routine, but carefully justified. The silence wasn't just cultural, it was political. Power vacuums in monarchies are dangerous things. Menelik had no adult son to succeed him. His appointed heir, Liege Ieyasu, was still a teenager, brash, erratic, and controversial. Empress Taitu, meanwhile, had her own ambitions and allies. Ethiopia had no written constitution at the time, no legal mechanism to transfer authority without outright coup, so the court pretended. They pretended the emperor still ruled, even as he sat motionless in his bed, listening to the world shift around him. For 6 years, Ethiopia was ruled in his name, but not by him. It was a strange purgatory. Ministers whispered, Taitu maneuvered, Ieyasu fumbled, all while Menelik remained imprisoned in his own body, surrounded by incense and silence. By 1910, a council had been formed to govern. Ieyasu was named regent. Taitu was pushed aside. But still, the emperor lived. The illusion had to be maintained. His death was reported prematurely more than once. Each time, the palace denied it. The people waited. Rumors spread. He finally died in December 1913. His death was announced with solemn grandeur. Obituaries hailed his victories, his modernizations, his unshakable will. No mention was made of the 6 years of silence, no acknowledgement of the physical decay, the loss of voice, the throne held by a body that could not command it. Menelik's legacy, like his reign, was carefully edited. Statues show him mounted on horseback, surveying battlefields. Murals depict him pointing toward victory. His image became a symbol of strength, unyielding, impervious, the man who defied Europe, the emperor who brought fire and steel to the highlands, the sovereign whose very name meant power. But beneath the myth is a more human truth. Menelik spent his final years as a monarch in name only, his mind trapped in a paralyzed frame, while his empire braced for the storm of succession. And that storm would come. Because the next king we meet also faced physical limitation, but this time from birth. His body never matched his legend. His limp was lifelong, his stature questioned, and yet he ruled Sparta. Next, Agesilaus II. Agesilaus II. Sparta was not known for forgiveness. It was a city-state built on the worship of perfection, of strength, symmetry, discipline. In Sparta, boys who were born weak or malformed were, according to legend, abandoned on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. Their lives were weighed against the needs of the state, and the state demanded warriors. So when Agesilaus II, lame from birth, was named king, it was not just unexpected, it was radical. His reign would become one of the longest in Spartan history, around 40 years, from roughly 400 to 360 BCE. A reign forged not through divine right, but through a strange twist of fate, intense political maneuvering, and an overwhelming drive to prove that a limp did not make a man any less a Spartan. In fact, his entire life would become a campaign against that very assumption. Agesilaus wasn't born to be king. He was a member of the Eurypontid dynasty, one of Sparta's 2 royal houses, but he was a younger son. His half-brother, Aegeis II, held the throne, and Agesilaus was largely raised to be a loyal aristocrat, not a ruler. But when Aegeis died childless, the succession became murky. A more obvious candidate existed, Leotychides, allegedly Agis' son, But rumors swirl that Leotychides was actually the illegitimate child of Alcibiades, the infamous Athenian exile turned traitor. Those whispers, combined with Spartan suspicion of scandal, cleared a path for Agesilaus. He was lame in one leg. Accounts suggest he may have had a clubfoot or some congenital malformation that caused a permanent limp. But this, in the end, was overlooked. Lysander, the architect of Sparta's final victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, backed Agesilaus. The support of Lysander, the most powerful man in Sparta at the time, tipped the scales. The ephors, always wary of public scandal, favoured a known noble with a known defect over a possibly illegitimate prince. In a twist worthy of Greek drama, the limp outweighed the scandal. And so, Agesilaus became king. But Sparta was not the kind of place where a ruler could hide behind protocol or palace walls. Spartan kings fought. They led armies in person. They marched with the phalanx. They stood in the mud, the heat, the blood. They wrestled with their men. A king who could not run, could not lunge, could not charge, what place did he have in such a world? Agesilaus didn't just rise to that challenge. He broke it in half. He made his limp a weapon, not literally, but symbolically. Every campaign he led, every battlefield where he appeared, every instance where he took up arms alongside his hoplites was a direct rebuke to the idea that he was weak. And he didn't just participate, he dominated. Agesilaus led expeditions into Asia Minor to confront the Persian Empire. He marched deep into enemy territory, scoring victories with cunning and speed. He fought in Boeotia. He laid siege to cities. He was wounded. He bled. He endured. And every time he showed up to lead an army, dragging his lame leg behind him, it told the same story. That Sparta didn't need perfection to conquer. It needed conviction. But the propaganda was subtle. This wasn't Egypt, with idealized statues, or Rome, with marble gods. Sparta rejected luxury. It rejected artifice. So Agesilaus' image wasn't hidden, it was minimized. He dressed plainly, ate simply. He sat with the soldiers, not the generals. His limp wasn't denied, it was drowned in austerity. But in Athens, in Thebes, in Persia, they noticed. The image of a Spartan king who limped into battle was both mockery and myth. Enemies laughed until he beat them, then they stared. What kind of society produced a ruler who led from the front, who refused golden armor, who limped into war, and still made entire cities surrender? Agesilaus, for all his physical limitation, became terrifyingly effective. But the flaw remained. In private, some Spartans questioned whether his deformity offended the gods. Xenophon, the philosopher and historian who idolized Agesilaus, insisted that the king's piety and virtue outweighed any bodily imperfection. But Sparta's religious elite were less sure. Omens were taken. Sacrifices made. Was the limp a curse? A sign? Nothing was ever said aloud, but suspicion lingered. And in time, his body did become a liability. By the end of his reign, after decades of war and walking with a crooked gait, Agesilaus was visibly aged. His leg deteriorated further. He could no longer ride or march as before. His influence waned. Sparta itself was weakening. The rigid discipline that had once made it invincible was crumbling under pressure from Thebes, Athens, and Macedon. Agesilaus continued to fight literally and politically until the end. He even took mercenary contracts in Egypt and Cyrene after Sparta's power declined. The lame king, now in his 80s, was still limping across deserts, still commanding armies, still proving himself. He died in foreign lands, not on a Spartan battlefield but in exile of a kind. He was returned to Sparta with full honors, embalmed like a fallen hero. And yet, history is still unsure what to make of him. Some saw him as a genius, a military innovator who preserved Sparta's power for a generation. Others saw him as a tragic figure driven by insecurity, compensating for his deformity with endless war. His reign was one of blood and steel, but it was also a mirror. It showed what Sparta feared most, that even in a society built to destroy the weak, weakness could wear a crown. That's the extremity. A man born into the least forgiving culture in the ancient world, who should have been discarded at birth, instead ruled it for 4 decades. But where Agesilaus walked with a limp, the next king on our list walked with a past full of scars. Scars carved from the battlefield itself. He lost an eye in war. He limped from leg wounds. And still, he forged a legacy that shaped an empire. Next, Philip II of Macedon. Philip II of Macedon. Before there was Alexander the Great, there was Philip. And if history were a little less obsessed with the son, the father would be known not merely as a king, but as a conqueror who carved empires from chaos using nothing but military genius, iron will, and a body broken in battle. Philip II of Macedon didn't inherit a kingdom so much as he inherited a target. When he took the throne in 359 BCE, Macedon was a fractured, feudal, and largely ignored northern kingdom, viewed by the Greeks as barbaric and backward. It had enemies on every border. Tribes raided its cities. Its nobles were treacherous. Its army was undisciplined. Philip took this mess and transformed it into a war machine. But he did it while carrying the weight of 2 serious disabilities, one eye lost and a leg that never healed properly. His limp and his scarred face weren't metaphors, they were facts. Visibly, unmistakably real. His physical injuries came later in life, but his fight for legitimacy began much earlier. Philip had grown up as a political hostage in Thebes, where he was exposed to high Greek culture, military strategy, and perhaps most importantly, the flaws of Greek unity. He saw firsthand how city-states fractured and bickered, how alliances frayed, and how politics could be more deadly than war. When he returned to Macedon and assumed power, Philip began an unprecedented campaign of reform. He professionalized the army, introduced the sarissa, a 6-meter-long spear that gave Macedonian phalanxes a terrifying reach. He trained his men rigorously and paid them regularly. War was no longer a seasonal hobby for noblemen, it was a science, and he was the professor. But greatness came at a cost, and Philip paid it in blood. In 354 BCE, during a siege at Methone, a strategically placed city on the Aegean, Philip was struck in the face by an enemy arrow or catapult fragment, depending on the source. The missile destroyed his right eye. There was no modern surgery, no way to save it. The eye was gone. He survived, barely, but the wound would change his appearance forever. From then on, Philip was blind on one side. His face bore the deep, unmistakable scar of the injury. He often wore a patch or kept the ruined eye covered. The paintings and busts of him from later periods tend to smooth out the details, as propaganda always does, but the damage was real. His portraits became symbols of grit, not glamour. But the eye was only the beginning. At some point later, sources differ on when Philip also sustained injuries to his leg, likely in battle or possibly from a riding accident. The damage left him with a permanent limp. The leg never healed properly. By the time his son Alexander was rising through the ranks, Philip was known as a limping, one-eyed warrior king. And yet, these physical flaws did not diminish him. If anything, they became part of his legend. Philip turned his injuries into armor, not in the literal sense, but in the mythological. He presented himself as a king who had bled for his people, a ruler who did not lead from behind silk curtains, but who took blows alongside his soldiers. The limp was a badge, the scar a seal. And for Macedonians especially, the hardened peasantry and tribal allies, this mattered. It made him real. While Greek city-states obsessed over ideals of symmetry and physical perfection, Philip broke the mold. His court didn't glorify him as a god. It showed him as a man who bled and still stood. He didn't hide his injuries. He used them. Still, the Greek world noticed, and not always kindly. Athenian orators like Demosthenes mocked Philip in speeches, calling him barbaric, drunken, crippled. But the irony was that every time they ridiculed him, he was winning. He was expanding his influence. He was taking cities without sieges, using marriage alliances, bribes, and military pressure. And when diplomacy failed, he sent his Sarissa phalanx to finish the job. Philip didn't need both eyes to see what Greece had become. By 338 BCE, he had effectively unified the fractured Greek world under Macedonian hegemony. At the Battle of Chaeronea, he crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, with his 8-year-old son Alexander commanding the left wing. Afterward, he formed the League of Corinth, a coalition of Greek states that acknowledged him as leader, paving the way for a planned invasion of Persia. He had achieved the unthinkable, but he wouldn't live to see the next phase. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated during the wedding celebrations of his daughter Cleopatra, not to be confused with the later Egyptian queen. He was stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, possibly part of a deeper conspiracy, possibly a personal vendetta. Even in death, the details remained political. He left behind an empire ready for expansion and a son raised in the shadow of his scarred, limping father. And that's part of the deeper extremity of Philip's story. He wasn't just a king with disabilities. He was a father whose damaged body became a blueprint for his son's glory. Alexander inherited the throne and the army, but more than that, he inherited the myth, the one-eyed warrior, the king who conquered despite his broken parts, the man who proved that war is won not with symmetry, but with strategy and stubbornness. Philip wasn't a god, he was more dangerous, a man with something to prove. And as brutal as his story was, the next king had even less to work with. One eye. Try only one from the start. Next, Antigonus I Monophthalmos. Antigonus I Monophthalmos. He was born in an empire that wasn't yet an empire, and died fighting to make it one again. Antigonus I Monophthalmos, one of the most brutal and brilliant of Alexander the Great's successors, lived a life of battles, betrayals, and empire building. His name Monophthalmos, or the One-Eyed, was no poetic flourish. It was a literal truth, earned on the battlefield and worn for decades like a crown of iron. In a world where optics mattered, where statues, coins, and royal processions were designed to portray kings as gods, Antigonus's face broke the mold. His missing eye didn't stop him from carving out one of the largest portions of Alexander's shattered world. In fact, it may have fueled his obsession to conquer the rest. He wasn't born into power. Antigonus came from sturdy but unremarkable Macedonian stock. He rose under Philip II and served under Alexander, but he wasn't among the favoured few. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 BCE with no clear heir, Antigonus was already an experienced general. He had commanded troops in Phrygia. He had fought in Asia. He had endured more than one near-death experience and carried the scars to prove it. One of those scars, of course, was his missing eye. He lost it during a siege, either at Perinthus or somewhere else on campaign in Asia Minor. The details are debated, as ancient sources often are, But what is consistent is the damage. The wound destroyed the eye entirely and left the surrounding socket deeply scarred. In a time without reconstructive surgery, prosthetics, or even decent gauze, the disfigurement would have been stark. He likely wore a patch or left it uncovered as a symbol of martial valor. Either way, it became part of his identity. Soldiers called him monophthalmos, sometimes with awe, sometimes with fear. But Antigonus never flinched from it. He embraced the image, even weaponized it. Unlike the polished imagery of Alexander, who was often sculpted in the style of youthful perfection, Antigonus leaned into the rugged, the real. His surviving portraits, though idealized by later Roman copyists, hint at a face marked by battle. Strong jaw, deep creases, one eye set beneath a heavy brow, the other, nothing, the void, the absence, a reminder. Because Antigonus wasn't interested in prettiness, he was interested in power. And when Alexander died, leaving behind a half-born empire and an infant son, the world tore itself apart. The Diadochi, the successors, each scrambled to grab a piece. What followed was nearly 4 decades of war. Coalitions formed and shattered, kings rose and fell. Macedonia itself passed hands like a hot coal. And through it all, Antigonus kept marching. He was relentless, unyielding, and above all, ambitious. Unlike many of the other successors who sought to defend their corner, Antigonus wanted all of it. The empire, the throne, the legacy. And his disability? It didn't disqualify him. It made him iconic. Here was a general who had lost an eye in the service of empire, who had given part of his face to history. He wore the loss like a badge, a relic of loyalty, or a promise of vengeance. Even as younger, flashier players entered the game. Demetrius, Seleucus, Ptolemy Antigonus stood tall. Uncompromising. Singular. He didn't hide. He didn't soften. He doubled down. But the propaganda machine still had to work overtime. Coins bearing Antigonus's image are rare and for a reason. The ancient world wasn't kind to physical imperfection in rulers. Even as he rose in power, there was a persistent tension. How do you present a disfigured king as divinely favored? The answer? You mythologize the disfigurement. In some court circles, his missing eye became symbolic, a sign that he saw truth more clearly than others, that he had sacrificed sight for insight, that he, unlike the squabbling successors, had vision. And vision he had. By 306 BCE, Antigonus declared himself king, not just satrap or regent, but basileus, the full Macedonian title. He wasn't the only one. Several other Diadochi followed suit. But Antigonus was different. He didn't just claim kingship. He tried to rebuild the empire. He crushed revolts, subdued Asia Minor, wrested control of the Aegean, installed his son Demetrius the Besieger as co-commander. The father-son team became infamous: Demetrius, the glittering playboy warrior, Antigonus, the one-eyed warfather. But there were cracks. The other successors, weary of his growing power, formed a grand coalition. In 301 BCE, at the Battle of Ipsus in central Anatolia, they confronted him with overwhelming force. The combined armies of Seleucus and Lysimachus met Antigonus and Demetrius in a showdown that would decide the future of Alexander's empire. Antigonus was over 80 years old, blind in one eye, battle-worn, yet still in the center of the line. He refused to yield, even when the tide turned, even when Demetrius's cavalry was drawn away, even when his flanks began to fold. He stood his ground, and he died on the field. Killed not in his sleep, not by intrigue or poison, but by spears and arrows, under the open sky, fighting for an empire he could almost see whole again. That's what makes Antigonus extreme. Not just the fact that he ruled with one eye, but that he ruled better for it. That he turned disfigurement into defiance. That he made it part of his legend. His legacy lived on through Demetrius, through the Antigonid dynasty that would eventually reclaim Macedon. But the man himself, Monophthalmos, remained unmatched. Because while one eye was gone, the other never blinked. And that image, flawed, fierce, half-sighted, would echo centuries later in another empire, one where deformity was shameful, where disability was hidden, and where a man stuttered, stumbled, and shook his way onto the throne. Next, Claudius. Claudius. In the imperial palace of Rome, amid its marble statues and perfumed corridors, Claudius was the man no one saw coming. He was not supposed to rule, not supposed to speak in public, not supposed to be remembered. He was, in the minds of his powerful family, a shameful shadow trailing behind the greatness of the Julio-Claudian line, a man born wrong in a world that demanded perfection. He had a limp. He stammered. He drooled when excited. His voice was harsh, his laugh strange. His posture was awkward, and his hands trembled. Ancient sources give us a spectrum of mockery. Some say he was a monster, others a fool, and still others described his movements as those of a puppet, jerky and inelegant. He was hidden from public life, excused from state functions, and generally written off by the imperial elite as harmless and half-broken. And yet he became emperor, one of the longest reigning emperors of the early Roman Empire. And one of the most competent. Let's step back. Claudius was born in 10 BCE into the most powerful family in Rome. His father, Drusus, was a celebrated general. His mother, Antonia Minor, the daughter of Mark Antony. His uncle was Emperor Tiberius. His great-uncle and adoptive grandfather was Augustus himself. His family tree was carved in marble, but Claudius's body was not. From early childhood, he was seen as defective. Most historians believe he had some form of cerebral palsy or a neurological disorder that caused motor issues and speech impairment. The exact diagnosis is lost to time, but the effects are well documented. Suetonius, the gossipy biographer of the emperors, writes that Claudius's own mother called him a monster, and his grandmother said he was only kept alive as a warning to others. His own family laughed at him at dinners, mocking his spasms and garbled words. So he was pushed to the margins. He was allowed to study, because no one expected him to do anything dangerous with knowledge. He became a scholar. He read obsessively. He wrote histories, some of which have survived in fragments. He developed an intricate understanding of law and governance, but still, he was never considered for power. Augustus ignored him. Tiberius sidelined him. Caligula humiliated him. Caligula, his nephew and predecessor, liked to drag Claudius out during banquets to make guests laugh. The stammering uncle, the shaking relic. He was a living joke. In public, Claudius was a patrician footnote. In private, he was writing, studying, waiting. Then came the knife. In 41 CE, after years of cruelty, erratic behavior, and open debauchery, Emperor Caligula was assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard. Chaos exploded in the palace. Senators scrambled. Guards looted, and in a side corridor, behind a curtain, someone found Claudius trembling, panicked, hiding. He was dragged before the soldiers, not as a conspirator, but as a curiosity. A man so obviously unfit to rule that his presence calmed the coup. But then something unexpected happened. The soldiers declared him emperor. Why? Several reasons. He was the last adult male of the Julio Claudian line. He posed no threat to them. And crucially, he could be controlled. Or so they thought. Claudius accepted the crown. And immediately, everything changed. The man who had spent 50 years as a court embarrassment became a policy machine. He reformed the courts, expanded the bureaucracy, and took direct control of imperial finances. He improved Rome's port infrastructure, built aqueducts, and introduced laws to protect slaves from unjust punishment. He led military campaigns, most famously the invasion of Britain in 43 CE, and added new provinces to the empire. He rewarded loyalty. He punished treason with precision. He didn't scream or posture or revel in blood like Caligula. He governed, and he did it while limping and stammering and drooling. Here's the extremity. Claudius didn't fix his disability. He didn't hide it. He ruled with it. His public appearances were stiff and strange. His voice never improved. His hands always shook. But his decrees were clear. His administration was efficient. And his enemies, who once laughed, began to fear him. He used that too. Claudius knew how he was seen, knew that the Senate considered him weak. So he strengthened the imperial bureaucracy, stacking it with freedmen loyal to him personally. He bypassed the senatorial class. He created a government that relied less on noble birth and more on administrative function, a move that shaped the Roman Empire for centuries. But his private life remained messy. He married 4 times. His third wife, Messalina, was notorious for her excesses and betrayals, eventually executed for conspiracy. His fourth, Agrippina the Younger, was more politically dangerous. She maneuvered her own son, Nero, into the line of succession, an act that may have led to Claudius's death. Some historians believe she poisoned him with mushrooms in 54 CE. He died at 63. Some say in his sleep. Others say in agony. And Rome mourned not deeply, but respectfully. He was not beloved. He was not hated. He was a surprise. But his story is one of the most extreme reversals in royal history. A man born with visible, uncontrollable impairments, mocked by family, hidden by empire, dragged into power as a puppet. And yet, he ruled with more intelligence and effectiveness than the golden boys before him. His legacy is paradoxical. The disability that had once been his prison became his weapon. He used others' underestimation as armor. He wrote laws while others wrote poems. He stabilized while others postured. He saw what others didn't, perhaps not clearly, but deeply. And though Claudius's body had betrayed him since birth, the next monarch on our list faced a betrayal of form as well, but one sculpted not by nature, but by disease, a spine that curved, a figure that twisted, a reputation warped beyond repair by Tudor propaganda. Next, Richard III. Richard III. For centuries, Richard III was the villain king. The child, murdering, throne-stealing, hunchback devil immortalized by Shakespeare's quill and reinforced by Tudor propaganda. His very body, we were told, betrayed the rot within, a deformed back, a twisted soul. Crookback Richard, hunched and snarling, a monster in a crown. But history is crueler than fiction, and reality even crueler still. Because Richard III did, in fact, have a severe physical deformity. But it wasn't the grotesque caricature penned for Elizabethan theatre. It was real, anatomical, painful, and profoundly misrepresented. He had scoliosis, a serious curvature of the spine. His ribcage was rotated. His right shoulder sat higher than the left. By the time he reached adulthood, Richard's torso had visibly twisted. He wasn't a misshapen goblin, but he was visibly and permanently physically different. His spine bent like a question mark, challenging everything a medieval king was supposed to embody: strength, symmetry, command. And in medieval England, appearance was politics. Let's go back. Richard was born in 1452, the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His bloodline was impeccable. He was Yorkist royalty through and through, descended from Edward III on both sides. But he entered the world during one of the most vicious civil conflicts in English history, the Wars of the Roses. The Plantagenets were eating each other alive. Lancaster versus York, brother against cousin, throne against throne. Into this came Richard, small, quiet, serious. As a boy, he was sent to train under the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker. He learned war, law, governance. He saw the court not as a place of opulence, but as a field of knives. But the body told its own story. His scoliosis didn't kill him, didn't cripple him, but it shaped him. Modern forensic analysis shows the curve began during adolescence, growing worse with age. He likely experienced chronic pain. He probably stood with an uneven gait. He might have worn specially tailored armor or had difficulty riding long distances without discomfort. His chest would have appeared slightly compressed, his silhouette distinct, and yet he became a warrior. That's the contradiction. Despite his spinal deformity, Richard led troops into battle. He wasn't cloistered in castles or shadowed by clerics. He fought at Barnet and Tewkesbury. He charged. He killed. He survived. The twisted spine didn't prevent him from becoming one of the most militarily competent nobles of his generation. In 1483, after the sudden death of his brother, Edward IV, Richard was named Lord Protector for his 2-year-old nephew, Edward V. The young king never made it to coronation. Within months, Richard took the crown for himself. The princes Edward and his brother Richard vanished into the Tower of London, and Richard III's fate was sealed. The disappearance of the princes remains one of history's great cold cases. Were they murdered? If so, by whom? Richard's enemies, especially the Tudors, painted him as the culprit, and they used his body to bolster their case. In Shakespeare's Richard III, written under Tudor patronage, the king is a monster from birth, rudely stamped, unfinished, cheated of feature. The hunchback became a metaphor, his physical difference equated with moral corruption. The Tudor regime didn't just want to dethrone Richard, it wanted to erase him as a man, to transform him into a cautionary tale. And it worked. For centuries. Schoolchildren grew up picturing a limping gargoyle of a king. Historians dismissed him as a blood-stained aberration. Artists depicted him with grotesque exaggeration. And all the while, the real man, the one with a spinal condition, not a monstrous form, vanished beneath the myth. But bones don't lie. In 2012, Richard III's skeleton was discovered under a parking lot in Leicester. His remains, hastily buried after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, were exhumed and examined. The findings were definitive. He had adolescent-onset scoliosis with a curvature of over 60 degrees. Enough to be visible, enough to alter posture, but not enough to prevent combat. No withered arm, no clubfoot, no hunchback. Just a spine curved by biology, not by vice. That discovery reframed everything. The image of Richard as a twisted tyrant didn't come from his body, it came from his enemies. His deformity didn't make him evil, it made him vulnerable. In a world where physical perfection was seen as divine favor, Richard's visible difference made him suspect. It gave his political rivals an opening, and they seized it with quills and daggers. But it didn't stop him from ruling. As king, Richard attempted reforms. He passed laws to protect landowners from illegal property seizures. He improved access to justice. He was, by the standards of the time, a competent administrator. But the shadow of the princes and the suspicion of usurpation loomed too large. In 1485, Henry Tudor invaded. At the Battle of Bosworth, Richard fought like a man possessed. Contemporary accounts describe him leading a cavalry charge directly at Henry, cutting through soldiers, nearly reaching the usurper himself. His spine may have been curved, but his blade was straight. He died surrounded by enemies, his helmet removed, his skull cleaved open. He was the last English king to die in battle. And yet, his legacy was buried under half a millennium of propaganda, a body misrepresented, a life misunderstood, until the bones beneath the asphalt whispered something closer to the truth. Here lies a king, one who ruled with pain, who carried a crooked spine into straight warfare, who was punished more for how he looked than what he did. A monarch whose physical form became a weapon used not by him, but against him. And while Richard's back curved under pressure, the next king's mind would bend in far stranger ways. A monarch haunted by invisible storms, not twisted by bones, but unraveled by thoughts. Next, Henry VI, Henry VI. If Richard III was the king shaped by scoliosis, Henry VI was the one shaped by silence. Not the silence of strategy, or the calculated pause of a shrewd monarch, but a hollow, vacant kind of silence. The kind that stretches across months. The kind that fills a throne room with dread. The kind that ends dynasties. Henry VI, King of England twice over, was not known for speeches, victories, or charisma. He was known for absence, absence of will, absence of presence, absence of command. The man whose name would become synonymous with national collapse reigned for nearly 4 decades, and for large parts of that time, he was mentally gone. He wasn't born into a broken legacy, quite the opposite. Born in 1421, he was the only son of Henry V, the warrior king of Agincourt fame, the English thunderbolt, who came within a hair's breadth of conquering France. Henry V was everything a medieval monarch was supposed to be: virile, victorious, commanding. His son inherited none of it. When Henry V died in 1422, the infant Henry VI became king at just 9 months old. He was the youngest monarch in English history, a baby swaddled in crimson, cradled by regents, and shielded from reality. England's glory days ended the day he took the throne. From the beginning, he was delicate. Not in body, he was reasonably healthy, but in spirit, quiet, introspective, gentle to a fault. Where his father had swung swords, Henry preferred prayer. He was more monk than monarch. His tutors praised his piety and patience, but worried about his detachment. He rarely laughed, rarely grew angry, rarely engaged. He floated through royal life like a man under water. Still, for a time, England held. The regents managed affairs until Henry came of age in 1437, but the moment he took personal control, the decline began. He was passive. He trusted the wrong people. He couldn't manage court factions. And while his advisors battled for control, France began reclaiming its territory. One by one, England's hard-won gains evaporated. But the true breakdown didn't come until 1453. That year, Henry VI suffered a catastrophic mental collapse. It was sudden, dramatic, and total. He stopped speaking, stopped moving, couldn't recognize his own child, couldn't react to stimuli. For over a year, he sat catatonic on the throne, staring through the world around him. The court descended into panic. A regency was installed. Richard, Duke of York, father to the future Richard III, was appointed protector. And then, in 1454, just as suddenly, Henry recovered. He opened his eyes, spoke, moved, recognized faces. The king was back at least, superficially. But the damage was done. What Henry suffered from is still debated. Some historians believe it was catatonic schizophrenia. Others suggest severe depressive episodes, possibly bipolar disorder. Contemporary sources called it madness, sickness of the mind, or simply the king's affliction. Whatever it was, it returned in waves, each one worse than the last. And his enemies took notice. The Wars of the Roses didn't begin just because of dynastic squabbles. They began because the king was mentally unfit to rule, and everyone knew it. Henry was a man whose mind could and did vacate the throne entirely. His episodes of catatonia weren't mere absences. They created a vacuum of power, and vacuums demand to be filled. Yorkists and Lancastrians began manoeuvring. Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry's formidable wife, took control in his stead, leading the Lancastrian cause in what would become a dynastic civil war. But even when he wasn't fully incapacitated, Henry's fragility was palpable. He lacked authority. He couldn't rally troops, couldn't inspire loyalty. Even his court portraiture feels ghostly, his figure pale, his posture limp, his eyes blank. Unlike monarchs who hid physical deformities, Henry couldn't hide what was happening inside. His blank silences in court became legend. Ambassadors would visit and report that the king sat motionless for hours. Lords would kneel and receive no response. Decisions were delayed. Orders were contradicted. And yet, through all of this, he remained king. The first reign ended in 1461, when Edward IV took the throne for the House of York. Henry fled, he hid in the north, was captured, paraded through London in humiliation, then imprisoned in the Tower. But in 1470, a bizarre twist brought him back. A temporary Yorkist breakdown and the defection of the Earl of Warwick restored Henry to the throne. For 6 months, he reigned again, though not really. He appeared in public, yes, but witnesses describe him as gaunt, vacant, barely responsive, a puppet in royal robes. Queen Margaret and Warwick ran the country. Henry stood like a prop. Then, in 1471, Edward IV returned. Battle was joined. Henry's son and heir, Edward of Westminster, was killed. Margaret captured, Warwick slain, and Henry once more was taken to the Tower. He was murdered there, likely on Edward's orders, just weeks later. Quietly, without trial, without ceremony. One report claims he died of melancholy. More likely, it was a dagger in the dark. But Henry VI wasn't remembered for battles. He was remembered for blankness. His reign was defined not by what he did, but by what he didn't. He didn't fight, didn't govern, didn't rule. He simply was, and sometimes not even that. And yet, here lies the extremity. Despite his mental fragility, Henry VI remains the only English king to have lost the crown twice and regained it once. His illness became a national crisis, his mind a public battleground, his silence the most deafening roar of the era. And as the country fractured around him, the myth of the Mad King began to harden. England would never forget the image of a monarch staring into the void. But if Henry's madness was intermittent, the next king's was unrelenting. His demons did not come in waves, they lived inside him, loud and daily. He didn't just withdraw from power, he tore through it. France's king of fire and hallucination, who danced with ghosts and feared his own reflection. Next, Charles VI, the mad Charles VI. the Mad. In the gold-gilded halls of the French monarchy, where divine right shimmered through polished mirrors and royal protocol masked mortal failings, King Charles VI of France didn't just fracture, he shattered. Not suddenly, not quietly, but in bursts of violent delusion, chilling clarity, and prolonged silence. Over a reign that lasted more than 4 decades, Charles VI came to embody the unthinkable, a king at war with his own mind. He was known as Charles the Beloved when he came to power in 1380. When he died in 1422, they called him Charles the Mad. The transformation wasn't just rhetorical, it was real, and it shook the very foundations of France. Charles became king at the age of 11 after the death of his father, Charles V, a wise and reform-minded monarch. Young Charles was bright, attractive, and physically vigorous, everything France hoped for in a king. He was raised under the regency of his uncles, who quickly enriched themselves and drained the state, while France simmered under the weight of plague, famine, and the 100 Years' War. At age 21, in 1388, Charles declared himself ready to rule. He ousted the greedy uncles, reinstated his father's trusted advisors, and embarked on a campaign of reform. There was hope, there was energy, there was, for a fleeting moment, a sense that France might claw its way back from chaos. Then, in 1392, something inside Charles broke. While leading a military expedition to Brittany to avenge an assassination attempt on one of his advisors, Charles suddenly became agitated, paranoid, distracted. Then, in the heat of the forest, he snapped. A man dropped a lance. The clatter echoed through the trees. Charles drew his sword and turned on his own men. He killed one knight and wounded several others before his attendants subdued him. Afterward, he collapsed, unconscious, cold. They carried him back to Paris in silence. The diagnosis was unclear then and now, but the symptoms were unmistakable. Charles's first breakdown marked the beginning of a long, erratic, and terrifying descent into madness. What followed were decades of instability, delusion, and absentee rulership. Episodes came in waves. During the worst, Charles could not recognize his wife or children. He forgot he was king. He babbled nonsense or refused to speak at all. He screamed. He struck people. He claimed he was made of glass and refused to be touched, lest he shatter. Yes, glass. The glass delusion, as it would come to be known, was one of Charles's most infamous afflictions. He believed his body was fragile, transparent, and would break if not handled with the utmost care. He wore iron rods sewn into his clothes to prevent accidental movement. He sat for hours without blinking. He refused to bathe, fearing water would dissolve him. Courtiers moved around him as if he were indeed a statue. No one dared touch the king. And when he was lucid, he was painfully aware of his condition. That's the horror of it. Charles wasn't always mad. He had moments of clarity days, sometimes weeks, when he returned to himself, when he ruled, when he spoke calmly. And then, without warning, the fog would descend again, and he'd become a different man, a ghost trapped in a golden cage. And the court had to pretend. Because France was in no position to admit its king was unfit. The 100 Years' War with England was still raging. The economy was battered. The nobility was divided into bitter factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, each vying for control of the throne in Charles's absence. A mad king was more than a personal tragedy. It was a national liability. So they hid him. They managed access. They choreographed appearances. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, often served as his proxy, though she was widely mistrusted. His brother, Louis of Orleans, stepped into the power vacuum, clashing violently with their cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. In 1407, Louis was assassinated in Paris, a murder that plunged France into civil war. All while Charles sat, eyes glazed, in the Louvre, speaking to walls. It was not a secret. The people knew, foreign ambassadors knew. Chronicles from the time speak of the king's illness with hushed awe. Physicians came and went. Holy relics were paraded before him. He was bled, purged, prayed over. Nothing worked. And yet, through all this, Charles remained king. France never dethroned him. They never declared him unfit. The legal fiction of his sovereignty was too sacred, too central. Instead, they ruled in his name, sometimes using his seal without consent, sometimes forging orders, sometimes simply ignoring him. His face still adorned coins, his name still opened decrees. It was a monarchy in denial, a crown with no center, and the consequences were catastrophic. In 1415, England under Henry V invaded again. The Battle of Agincourt was a slaughter. French knights, disorganized and divided, were massacred. The royal house was too fractured to respond. By 1420, Charles was so removed from governance that his queen signed the Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting their son, the Dauphin, and naming Henry V heir to the French throne. It was a betrayal rooted in desperation. Charles, alive but unreachable, was powerless to stop it. He died in 1422, within weeks of Henry V's own death. France was now officially split, part ruled by the English, part by the loyalists of Charles's son, the future Charles VII. The country Charles VI left behind was broken, divided politically, scarred emotionally, and haunted by the image of a king who believed he was glass. But make no mistake, Charles was not merely a victim. His reign represents one of the most extreme cases of royal disability in recorded history. He wasn't hidden away in infancy or removed after a single collapse. He remained on the throne for 42 years, oscillating between lucidity and madness, while a nation tried to function around him. His illness was not just mental, it was structural. The monarchy bent around it, the court warped itself into something barely recognizable, and the kingdom already fragile broke. Yet, as extraordinary as Charles's madness was, his body remained intact. The next monarch was not so lucky. He was born twisted, grew worse with time, couldn't chew properly, couldn't father children, could barely speak. His face was a roadmap of deformity, and his dynasty was the grotesque end of centuries of inbreeding. Next, Charles II, El Hechizado. Charles II, El Hechizado. In the corridors of the Spanish royal court, beneath the chandeliers and gilded tapestries, one man's face told the story of an empire in decline. Charles II, known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was the final sovereign of the Spanish Habsburg line. His body, from birth, was a living monument to centuries of genetic recklessness. His reign marked not just the slow unraveling of a once global empire, but the grotesque end of a dynasty that had pushed bloodlines beyond the brink. He was born in 1661. From the first moment he opened his mouth, misshapen and unable to latch, whispers spread through the palace. Something was wrong. He was the product of generations of cousin marriage, the grandchild of a double uncle and niece union. The genetic stew had curdled, and the result was a child who struggled to feed, walk, speak, or grow. The royal physicians tried to be optimistic. The court tried to pretend. But Charles's deformities were too visible, too dramatic, too undeniable. His jaw jutted grotesquely forward, a classic sign of mandibular prognathism, now known globally as the Habsburg jaw. His upper jaw was underdeveloped. His lower jaw protruded so far that he couldn't properly close his mouth or chew without difficulty. Eating was laborious, speaking was worse. His tongue was oversized and uncooperative. His speech was slurred and hard to understand. At court ceremonies, the crowd sometimes strained to make sense of their monarch's words. And that was just the face. His body was frail, his limbs thin, his coordination poor. He was late to walk. He didn't speak until he was nearly 4. His mind developed slowly, if at all. Throughout his life, he was plagued by seizures, mysterious illnesses, and chronic gastrointestinal issues. He was often confined to bed. His height remained stunted, his energy minimal. And yet, somehow, he became king. When Charles II ascended to the Spanish throne in 1665, he was just 4 years old. His father, Philip IV, had died himself, the product of extensive inbreeding, but still able-bodied enough to rule and reproduce. Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, became regent, and for years she ruled in his name, while the court tried desperately to deny what everyone could see. The king was broken. There was no hiding it. No sculptor could smooth out that jaw. No painter could fully erase the slack posture or the glassy gaze. Still, they tried. Royal portraits of Charles II present a stiff, pale figure dressed in impeccable brocade, surrounded by dogs, symbols of loyalty, and Catholic iconography. But the eyes are distant. The mouth droops. The body slumps. The brush can only lie so far. The Spanish court became a place of constant image management. Charles was rarely allowed to speak in public without pre-scripted support. He appeared at ceremonies in elaborate regalia designed to compensate for his physical awkwardness. Public appearances were tightly controlled. His fragility became a state secret disguised in full view. And yet, Spain needed more than a symbol. It needed an heir. That became the great obsession of Charles's reign: reproduction. Could he sire a child? Could this distorted body, barely able to chew its food, produce the next king? The answer was no. Charles II was married twice, first to Marie Louise of Orleans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both were young, beautiful, and carefully chosen for fertility. Both failed to produce an heir. For years the blame was pinned on the queens. Court physicians interrogated their fertility. Rumors swirled. But behind closed doors, it was clear. The problem was Charles. He was impotent. Documents suggest his genitalia were underdeveloped. He likely suffered from multiple endocrine disorders. His body, so visibly marked by his lineage's desperate desire to keep power in the blood, could not pass that blood on. And the irony is unbearable. A dynasty obsessed with genetic purity created a monarch incapable of continuation. Politically, Charles's reign was one of decline. Spain's dominance had already waned by the time he took the throne, but under his rule, the unraveling accelerated. The military crumbled. The economy faltered. Corruption bloomed. Ministers rotated like bad actors in a doomed play, each blaming the last for the empire's collapse. Charles, mostly passive, was rarely the villain but never the solution. His mother dominated early policy, appointing her favorites and alienating the nobility. Later, various factions jockeyed for control. France and Austria loomed, each angling for influence through marriage alliances and backroom diplomacy. The Spanish court became a puppet theatre of foreign interests, with Charles blinking slowly at center stage. His nickname, El Hechizado, was born from more than just mockery. Many in Spain genuinely believed Charles was cursed. How else to explain his failings? The sickly boy. The impotent man. The monarch who couldn't command a horse, a parliament, or a bedroom, exorcists were summoned, holy relics paraded, black magic was blamed. They were fighting genetics with incense. And it only got worse. In his final years, Charles degenerated rapidly. His body withered. He could barely digest food. His skin turned sallow. He hallucinated. He heard voices. He believed himself possessed. His court watched, helpless, as the king slipped into decay. He made desperate pilgrimages to healing shrines. At one point, he ordered the disinterment of his dead ancestors so he could examine their corpses, seeking answers among the bones of the men who had cursed him. He died in 1700, at the age of 38, without an heir. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line. The War of Spanish Succession would follow a continent-wide conflict sparked by one man's sterile body. And here lies the extremity. Charles II wasn't just disabled, he was the disability of a dynasty. His entire body, jaw, gut, spine, mind was a roadmap of genetic collapse. He was the living consequence of dynastic obsession, the final syllable in a centuries-long experiment in hereditary power. No spin could mask it, no art could beautify it. Charles's deformities weren't whispers, they were declarations. His face didn't just reflect a failing king, it reflected a failing system. But Charles was not alone. His jaw wasn't unique. His features weren't isolated. His body was the collective inheritance of a family line obsessed with itself. And that line across generations produced rulers as visibly marked as he was. Next, the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty. If Charles II was the grand, grotesque finale, then the Habsburg dynasty was the epic saga that set the stage generation after generation of Europe's most powerful family breeding itself into biological implosion. This was not just royalty, it was genetic theology. Bloodlines sanctified by divine right and cemented by marriage contracts written in Latin and sealed with cousinly kisses. For over 5 centuries, the Habsburgs ruled an empire where titles outnumbered teeth and deformity was a side effect of ambition. Their motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did, again and again. Across borders, branches, and increasingly narrow gene pools. The Habsburgs didn't just intermarry with other royal houses, they intermarried with themselves. Uncles with nieces, first cousins, double cousins. The Spanish and Austrian lines twisted around each other like a double helix with a death wish. And nowhere was the cost of that ambition more visible than in their faces. The Habsburg jaw, technically called mandibular prognathism, became the most iconic and grotesque hallmark of royal inbreeding. It wasn't just a cosmetic quirk. It was a deformity that could make chewing difficult, speech impaired, and facial expressions stiff or unnatural. A forward-thrusting lower jaw, a receding upper jaw, often accompanied by thick lips, a bulbous nose, and an elongated face. Over time, the features grew more pronounced. Subtle asymmetry gave way to cartoonish imbalance. Portraits show monarchs whose mouths never quite closed, whose chins jutted defiantly at history, whose lineage was carved in the bone. And it wasn't just Charles II. Philip IV, his father, had the jaw. Ferdinand IV had it. Maximilian I had the nose and the droop. Every generation compounded the deformity not just physically, but politically. Because as the royal bloodline narrowed, so too did the options for marriage, succession, and governance. Power was consolidated, yes, but at the expense of vitality. The body politic became a literal body, sick, twisted, fragile. In 2019, A group of geneticists published a study that analyzed 11 portraits of Habsburg monarchs, cross-referenced with genealogical data. The findings were clear. The degree of inbreeding in the Habsburg line correlated directly with the severity of their jaw deformities. Charles II, the most inbred of them all, scored off the charts. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, the equivalent of the child of siblings. But while Charles was the terminus, he was not the only warning sign. Philip II of Spain, who ruled during the Spanish Golden Age, suffered from chronic health problems, depression, and a rigid, melancholic personality. Symptoms that modern historians suggest may also have stemmed from genetic complications. His portraits show a jaw like a shelf, his expression frozen, his gaze distant. Emperor Leopold I, ruling from Vienna, had a famously elongated face, deep-set eyes, and thick lips, his features so distinct that caricatures of him were banned. He was deeply devout and highly intelligent, but physically awkward and likely infertile for much of his life. Then there was Emperor Charles V, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, ruling both the Holy Roman Empire and Spain at its peak. His face was so striking that even his allies noted it. The jaw protruded, the speech was slurred, and still, he conquered continents. His physical condition didn't prevent greatness, but it became part of his mythos. The man with a world empire and a face shaped like a fortress wall. For the Habsburgs, deformity was normalized. The portraits don't flinch. There are no attempts to beautify. The artists simply painted what they saw. Jaws out of alignment, mouths unable to close, eyes sunken beneath heavy brows. The deformity became aesthetic, part of the brand. You could tell a Habsburg by their silhouette. Their profile was currency. But behind those canvases were lives warped by biology. Mandibular prognathism is not merely cosmetic. It affects eating, digestion, and speech. It can make breathing difficult during sleep. It changes the way others perceive and interact with you. And when that deformity is inherited not once, but over and over, stacked across cousins, reinforced by deliberate incest, the body becomes a battlefield for decisions made centuries ago. Yet, for all their flaws, the Habsburgs endured. That's the deeper extremity here, not just that they ruled while deformed, but that they kept ruling anyway, for centuries. Despite the mounting physical evidence that something was deeply wrong with their approach to inheritance, they doubled down. They kept marrying within, kept naming nephews as successors, kept ignoring the visible consequences. Because the Habsburg project wasn't about health, it was about divine right. And divine right, by definition, cannot be questioned. If the king has trouble chewing, it must be God's will. If the emperor slurs his words and walks with a strange gait, it's not deformity, it's providence. The state's ideology depended on the body of the monarch being not just legitimate, but sacred. And so, the deformity became holy, a mark of continuity, a seal of authenticity, even as it threatened to bring the entire system down. By the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, the dynasty had effectively inbred itself into oblivion. The Austrian line lasted a little longer, finally fading into extinction in the early 18th century. But the legacy of the jaw remains. It is the most visible, measurable, genetic signature of a royal house that mistook lineage for immortality. And perhaps the most haunting part? The deformity didn't just kill a dynasty, it defined it. The Habsburgs weren't victims of circumstance. They were architects of their own biological collapse. The twisted jaws were not random, they were inherited, engineered, prioritized. The portraits hang in museums, the names are etched in history books, but the bones tell the real story. And if the Habsburgs passed down deformity through deliberate design, the next monarch on our list inherited a damaged body from illness, crippling one side, dulling the mind, and forcing a kingdom to function around the husk of a king. Next, Afonso VI. Afonso VI. If Charles II of Spain was the tragic crescendo of a dynasty collapsing under its own genetic weight, Afonso VI of Portugal was the twisted overture of a monarchy caught between premature power and a body betrayed by illness. His reign, spanning from 1656 to 1683, was less a story of governance than of governance by proxy, of paralysis, both literal and political, of a king whose body and mind were declared unfit not just by enemies, but by his own family, and, in the end, even by his own wife. Afonso's story begins, as so many royal tragedies do, with disease. He was born in 1643, the son of João IV, the king who had restored Portuguese independence from Spain after 60 years of Iberian union. João was strong, shrewd, and beloved. Afonso was his second son, and from the start, there were signs that something was not right. At the age of 3, Afonso suffered a violent illness, most likely encephalitis or meningitis. The fever broke, but the damage remained. The effects were permanent. Afonso was left with hemiplegia paralysis on the left side of his body. His arm hung limp, his leg dragged, his movements were jerky and coordination poor, but that was only the visible part. More troubling still were the neurological symptoms. Afonso's speech was slow and slurred. His cognitive development lagged. His moods were unpredictable. He veered between sullen withdrawal and bursts of manic energy. Modern diagnoses vary. Some historians suggest cerebral palsy. Others believe there was a more complex blend of developmental delay and neurological trauma. What's certain is that Afonso was not fully present, either mentally or physically, for much of his early life. But that didn't matter to the rules of succession. His older brother, Teodosio, died in 1653. That left Afonso the heir, and when João IV died in 1656, the 13-year-old Afonso became king, or rather, king in name. His mother, Luisa de Guzman, became regent, and a powerful one. For the next decade, she ran the kingdom with precision. Portugal was still in the throes of the Restoration War against Spain. Luisa maintained alliances, raised armies, and negotiated peace treaties. Meanwhile, Afonso was carefully managed, shielded from major decisions, his disabilities quietly downplayed. But Afonso was growing up, and the crown could only be held in trust for so long. In 1662, at age 19, Afonso staged a palace coup. Backed by a faction of nobles tired of Luisa's control, he forcibly removed his mother from power and exiled her to a convent. It was the moment he formally assumed rule, and the moment the court began to quietly unravel. Because Afonso, now king and fool, did not rule. He drank, he partied, he hunted, awkwardly, with great effort and physical strain. He surrounded himself with sycophants, most notoriously Luis de Vasconcelos e Sousa, the Count of Castelo Melhor, who effectively ran the government in Afonso's name. Castelo Melhor was brilliant, ambitious, and manipulative. He used Afonso's disability like a shield, consolidating power behind the king's broken facade. Afonso wasn't oblivious. He knew he was being used, but he lacked the capacity or the will to resist. His court was a mixture of theatrical displays and real dysfunction. Ceremonies were maintained. Laws were signed, but most decisions came from Castelo Melhor. And while Portugal achieved military successes, particularly in the final battles of the Restoration War, none of that success was attributed to the king himself. In 1666, Afonso married Maria Francisca of Savoy, a French noblewoman chosen for her elegance and political connections. It was a marriage that should have stabilized the monarchy. Instead, it destroyed it. The marriage was a disaster from the first night. Maria Francisca later testified that the marriage was never consummated. Afonso, she claimed, was physically incapable of intercourse. She reportedly said he could not perform the duties of a husband. The court buzzed with scandal. Was it impotence, disinterest, a product of his early illness? Whatever the cause, the consequence was seismic. Within a year, Maria sought an annulment, and she got it. On the grounds of non-consummation, the marriage was dissolved. But it wasn't just a personal rejection. It was a political earthquake. In 1668, with backing from Maria, Castello Melchor's enemies, and the powerful Duke of Cadaval, Afonso's younger brother, Pedro, seized control. He was declared Prince Regent. Afonso was deposed without a fight. Not murdered, not exiled, not imprisoned in a foreign land. He was kept in his own palace. He lived in forced isolation for the next 15 years, technically still king, but with no power, no authority, no role. The court simply moved on without him. And the final humiliation? His ex-wife married his brother. Maria Francisca, having annulled her marriage to Afonso, married Pedro, the man who had deposed her former husband. The same woman who had declared Afonso unfit now wore the crown beside his replacement. It was a public statement. Afonso was not only unfit to rule, he was unfit to be. And yet, he lingered. Afonso lived until 1683. He died at 40, still technically King of Portugal. His reign was one of the longest in Portuguese history, but also one of the most hollow. A king sidelined not by conquest or assassination, but by the betrayal of his own body and the slow, procedural dismantling of his dignity. His legacy is complex. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't cruel. He didn't wage wars of vanity or massacre his enemies. But he also didn't govern. His reign, in many ways, was a prolonged, court-sanctioned lie. The pageantry of monarchy maintained around a man who could not fulfill its most basic expectations. He was not born to fail, but he was built to fall. And fall he did, gracefully, quietly, utterly. But while Afonso's collapse was administrative, the next monarch's descent was internal. A mind unraveling in full daylight, a queen lost to the storm within. Next, Maria I of Portugal. Maria I of Portugal. She was called Maria the Pious in official titles, Maria the Mad in whispered rumours, and by the end, neither name quite captured the full scope of her unravelling. Maria I of Portugal, the first woman to rule the country in her own right, was a monarch caught between the Enlightenment and personal apocalypse. Her reign began with promised reform, culture, diplomacy, and ended in one of the most severe, documented descents into royal madness ever preserved. What made Maria's story so extreme wasn't just the collapse, it was the contrast. She began her rule as a formidable, devout, intelligent sovereign. She ended it howling through the corridors of her palace, restrained by her own family, forgotten by the very church she once served. Let's begin with the woman she was before the fall. Maria was born in 1734 to King José I of Portugal and Mariana Victoria of Spain. From a young age, she was devout, almost pathologically so. Her education emphasized religion, morality, and royal duty. She read extensively, corresponded with religious thinkers, and took confession with an intensity that unnerved some priests. Her piety was not performative. It was absolute. When her father died in 1777, Maria ascended the throne at 43, becoming the first ruling queen of Portugal. She immediately set about undoing the damage of her father's absolutist policies. She dismissed the powerful and deeply unpopular Marquis of Pombal, a minister known for brutal authoritarian control and Enlightenment-style secularism. Maria wanted to roll back some of those reforms, not out of ignorance, but out of conviction. She reinstated the influence of the Catholic Church. She promoted religious education. She governed with a blend of maternal care and doctrinal rigidity. The people loved her at first. She married her uncle, Pedro III, years earlier, a dynastic match meant to consolidate power. Despite the incestuous lineage, a hallmark of the Iberian royal houses, they appeared to genuinely care for each other. Pedro was supportive, but politically irrelevant. Maria made the decisions. She was firm, devout, and confident. The kingdom prospered. Then, the lights began to dim. The first tremors of instability appeared in the 1782nd. Her eldest son, Jose, died of smallpox. It was a sudden, devastating loss. Maria, who had always been emotionally intense, took it hard. She withdrew from court, began fasting excessively. Her confessions became darker, longer, more obsessive. She started experiencing hallucinations, visions of demons, of damnation, of God's wrath. Then her husband, Pedro, died. Her mental state crumbled further. By 1792, the Queen was no longer functioning as a ruler. Her behavior was erratic, often violent. She wept uncontrollably for hours. She screamed at night. She had to be physically restrained. Her religious fervor had mutated into something terrifying. She believed she was eternally damned, that she had committed unpardonable sins. She refused to eat, claiming to be unworthy of sustenance. She believed the walls were watching her, that angels were cursing her, that the throne itself was an affront to God. It wasn't grief anymore. It was psychosis. The court, horrified and embarrassed, began the familiar ritual of concealment. Maria's son Joe, later Joe VI, assumed power as regent in 1799, but Maria was still alive, still technically queen, so she was hidden away. Not in exile, not in a convent, in her own palace. Doctors were summoned. The most famous was Francis Willis, the same English physician who had treated King George III. Willis arrived in Lisbon in 1793 and assessed the Queen. His diagnosis was blunt, incurable. He recommended strict seclusion, minimal stimulation, and a rotating staff of attendants trained to manage violent outbursts. Maria's illness, likely a form of bipolar disorder with psychotic features or schizophrenia, had reached a permanent, catastrophic stage. She would never recover. And yet, Portugal had to continue. As Europe erupted in the Napoleonic Wars, Maria remained a silent, unseen presence behind the curtains of the royal court. She was still the queen. Coins bore her name. Decrees were written in the name of her most faithful majesty. But she had no voice in governance, no place in statecraft. Her condition became a state secret, though not a well-kept one. Foreign ambassadors gossiped about the mad queen. Portuguese citizens whispered that the monarch was possessed. Religious officials, many of whom had once adored her piety, now avoided involvement, fearing scandal. By 1807, the French army was advancing. Portugal was under threat. João, still technically regent, made a decision that would redefine the country's history. The entire royal family, including Maria, would flee to Brazil. The voyage was extraordinary. Over 15,000 nobles, Clerics and servants sailed across the Atlantic. Maria, disoriented and sick, was among them. Her madness did not subside on the ocean. She screamed during storms. She wept for lost children who were never born. She believed the sea itself was a form of purgatory. And all the while, her attendants managed her with quiet professionalism, as they had for over a decade. In Brazil, the Portuguese court established itself in Rio de Janeiro. It became the de facto capital of the empire, and Maria became the first European monarch to rule from the New World, though, again, only in name. She lived in seclusion in a palace turned asylum, surrounded by walls, priests, and whispers. She was a monarch in limbo, no longer queen in fact, but never formally deposed. She died in 1816 at the age of 81. Her reign, officially the longest of any Portuguese monarch up to that point, was both one of Portugal's most progressive and most tragic. A woman who began as a powerful, respected sovereign died believing she was in hell. Her illness wasn't physical. It left no visible deformity, but it was no less disfiguring, no less extreme. Maria, I was a monarch trapped in the prison of her own mind. She wasn't incompetent. She wasn't a puppet. She was a ruler undone by sorrow, racked by belief, and abandoned by biology. Her madness wasn't sudden. It was an avalanche that began with grief and ended in spiritual annihilation. And while her mind fractured under the weight of loss and faith, the next royal on her list inherited a more ancient affliction. A body racked by seizures, shaped by superstition, and crowned not with confidence but with the trembling quiet of an emperor who reigned under constant threat from within. Next, Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand I of Austria. To rule an empire while shaking uncontrollably is one thing. To do it while everyone around you is pretending you're not shaking at all, that's a very different kind of tragedy. Ferdinand I of Austria, Emperor of the Habsburg Empire, from 1835 to 1848, was a man born into one of Europe's most rigid and ceremonial dynasties, only to become its softest secret. His reign is less a chronicle of deeds than of dysfunction. His legacy, a whisper, a tremor, a reign so devoid of actual rule that history often forgets it happened at all. Ferdinand was born in 1793 into the already genetically compromised Habsburg dynasty, son of Emperor Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, both of whom carried Habsburg blood. The dynasty had long paid the biological price for its obsession with dynastic purity, and Ferdinand was no exception. From infancy, it was clear that something wasn't quite right. He had difficulty controlling his limbs. His head jerked involuntarily. He was prone to seizures, violent, full-body convulsions that could strike without warning. And he had many. By the time he was an adolescent, he was experiencing regular epileptic seizures. Some historians estimate he suffered hundreds, perhaps thousands, over the course of his life. He also exhibited signs of developmental delay. His speech was labored, his handwriting was nearly illegible, his memory was erratic. While he was not unintelligent, his cognition was uneven, brilliant at moments, baffled at others. Today, most historians believe Ferdinand lived with a combination of epilepsy and intellectual disability, exacerbated by generations of Habsburg inbreeding. In an era with no effective treatments for neurological conditions, his caretakers did what royal systems always do when faced with inconvenient truth. They wrapped it in velvet and pretended it wasn't there. They taught him court manners, fed him lines, ensured he learned Latin, though his tutors reported he often forgot entire passages the next day. They tailored his public appearances to the minute, choreographing his movements so carefully that even his seizures could be masked as fatigue. He was kept away from real power. He was paraded, adored, shielded. And when his father died in 1835, Ferdinand was crowned Emperor of Austria. Not because he was ready, not because he was wanted, but because no one else could be. The Habsburg Empire in the 1832nd was enormous, multicultural, and volatile. It encompassed modern-day Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, parts of Italy, Romania, Poland, and the Balkans. It required deft political management, linguistic diversity, and above all, strong leadership. Ferdinand provided none of it. The moment he was crowned, a de facto regency took over. Real power lay in the hands of Prince Metternich, the towering conservative diplomat and architect of post-Napoleonic Europe. Alongside Metternich was a council of ministers who acted with the emperor's seal, but rarely with his input. Ferdinand was emperor in title, but not in deed. He signed what he was told to sign, attended ceremonies where he was carefully monitored for signs of neurological distress, smiled, bowed, and waved. It was a government running on autopilot, with a monarch who could barely control his own hands, and yet, the absurdity of the arrangement was both deeply sad and occasionally darkly comic. Ferdinand is perhaps best known for a supposed quote during the 1848 revolutions. When advised that Vienna was in full uprising, the emperor is said to have blinked in confusion and asked, "But am I not the emperor?" A moment that revealed the full extent of his detachment. Whether or not the quote is apocryphal doesn't matter. It captured the national mood. The emperor had become irrelevant. Behind palace doors, Ferdinand lived in a world of routines. He had deep affection for mechanical devices and musical instruments. He played the piano, sometimes for hours. He was known for his love of food, particularly dumplings. One of his more bizarre anecdotes involves him allegedly insisting on being served dumplings during a seizure, slurring out, "I am the emperor and I want dumplings." But his life was not a farce. It was a slow erosion of dignity. He married in 1831 to Maria Anna of Savoy, a woman reportedly chosen because she wouldn't challenge the court's management of Ferdinand. They had no children. The marriage was childless, but relatively affectionate. She became one of his few consistent companions during episodes of illness. By the mid-1842, the storm was brewing. Europe was on the verge of revolution. Nationalist movements were rising, liberal ideologies were spreading, and Austria, with its rigid censorship and reactionary policies, was a powder keg. Ferdinand could not respond. He didn't understand the threats. He couldn't manage political compromise. He couldn't even conduct a coherent speech to Parliament without assistance. So in 1848, after a wave of revolutions broke out across the empire, Ferdinand was finally persuaded gently, with ceremony and ritual, to abdicate. He signed the documents without fully grasping what they meant. The crown passed not to his brother, but to his nephew, Franz Joseph I, who would go on to become one of the longest reigning emperors in European history. Ferdinand retired to Prague. There, he lived out the rest of his life in quiet, dignified obscurity, no longer the emperor, but still addressed with reverence. He gardened. He walked. He occasionally played piano. The seizures continued, but in the absence of pressure, he was content. He lived until 1875, outliving not just the court that once managed him, but much of the old world itself. Ferdinand wasn't a tyrant. He didn't oppress. He didn't rule with cruelty or arrogance. His extremity lies in the sheer contradiction of his existence. A man who could barely command a sentence expected to command a continent. He reigned because he had to, not because he could. His signature appeared on declarations of war, treaties, royal edicts, but his hand trembled with every letter. The empire spoke with his voice, but he barely understood what was being said. Ferdinand's reign was a ghost act, a political ventriloquism, and yet it lasted 13 years. But where Ferdinand's disability was covered with layers of protocol, the next monarch on our list found a way to confront his publicly and even reshape his own identity around it. His words may have stammered, but his reign resonated far beyond the microphone. Next, George VI. George VI. He never wanted the throne. In fact, he dreaded it. George VI, born Albert Frederick Arthur George, was the shy, second son of a bombastic monarch and the quieter, steadier one who stood behind the flashbulbs. His older brother, Edward VIII, was the one bred for spectacle, for charm, for power. Bertie, as his family called him, was the awkward one, the anxious one, the one who couldn't finish a sentence in front of a crowd without seizing up in embarrassment. But fate doesn't care about stage fright, and history doesn't ask for volunteers. When Edward VIII abdicated in 1936 to marry an American divorcee, George VI was shoved into the spotlight. Suddenly, the man who could barely speak in public without choking on his own words had to become the voice of the British Empire. And that's where the extremity lies, not in the condition itself, but in the impossibility of the role it crashed into. George VI was a man with a crippling stammer, asked to lead a nation into war with his voice. And he didn't run. He endured. From early childhood, George VI suffered from a severe speech impediment, most notably a chronic stammer. Today we understand stammering or stuttering as a neurological speech disorder often linked to genetics, stress and trauma. But in Edwardian Britain, it was interpreted as a failure of character. Weakness. A flaw that had to be stamped out with force. So they tried. Young Bertie was drilled relentlessly, forced to speak with pebbles in his mouth, to repeat syllables for hours, to undergo endless exercises that only deepened the shame. The more they pressured him to speak, the more his words froze in his throat. Social events were agonizing. School was worse. He was mocked by peers, misunderstood by teachers, and judged silently by his own royal family. To make matters worse, he was naturally left-handed, something aggressively corrected by his tutors. He was also sickly, knock-kneed, timid. His father, George V, was strict and remote, with little patience for softness. His mother, Queen Mary, was dignified and cold, a woman of porcelain standards and iron expectations. Bertie grew up in a palace filled with ticking clocks, stiff upholstery, and almost no emotional warmth. But he tried. He served in the Royal Navy during World War I, though he was frequently ill. He was present at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. He learned to fly. He married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, a rare love match in royal circles, and built a family anchored in affection and normalcy. His wife was vivacious and sharp. His daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, adored him. Away from microphones, he was warm, even funny. But the microphone was always waiting. When his brother, Edward VIII, abdicated in scandal, Bertie became King George VI. He was devastated. He told friends he wasn't up to the job. His stammer, he believed, made him unfit to rule. But the alternative was a constitutional crisis. The monarchy itself teetered. The public needed a steady hand. The crown needed a voice. Enter Lionel Logue, an unorthodox Australian speech therapist with no formal medical degree. Logue became George VI's secret weapon. Their relationship, later dramatized in the King's Speech, was built on trust, repetition, and deep psychological work. Logue didn't just teach the king how to breathe through syllables, he helped him confront the shame attached to speech. And the king worked, every day, practicing with marbles, rehearsing speeches line by line, developing strategies to manage nerves. He didn't overcome his stammer, he learned to master it just enough to speak. Then came the war. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, George VI had to address the nation via radio. It was the defining moment of his life. A man who had spent decades avoiding microphones now had to lead his people with one. The speech wasn't perfect. There were hesitations, tics, pauses that hung in the air like held breath. But it was his voice. The people heard it and believed in it. He wasn't eloquent, but he was sincere. He wasn't polished, but he was present. And in a world unraveling into chaos, that mattered more than rhetoric. Throughout the war, George VI became a symbol of quiet resilience. He refused to leave London during the Blitz. When Buckingham Palace was bombed, he famously said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." He toured hospitals, inspected bomb shelters, visited troops. He spoke often, always with careful preparation. His stammer never disappeared, but it became part of the persona, the king who stuttered and yet spoke. The monarch who found the courage to face his greatest fear, public speech over and over again, because his country needed him to. His health suffered. The stress of war, compounded by a lifelong smoking habit, led to chronic illness. He developed lung cancer, had part of his lung removed, his energy waned. But he carried on. He died in 1952, at the age of 56. His death was mourned deeply, not because of the pageantry, but because of what he had represented: duty without glamour, strength without spectacle. A king who wasn't born to lead, but became a leader anyway. George VI's disability was invisible until he opened his mouth, and when he did, the words came slowly, haltingly, imperfectly. But they came, and that, alone, was radical. In a world that demanded fluency, smoothness, and dominance, he offered something else: vulnerability, made royal. His reign showed that disability didn't have to disqualify leadership, that imperfection could humanize monarchy, that sincerity could substitute for eloquence. And for the first time in centuries, the British monarchy was emotionally accessible, not because of ceremony, but because the king stammered and still spoke. But while George VI confronted his disability, the next monarch on our list never had that luxury. His deformity was not internal. It was physical, visible, unhideable, so much so that every photo, every painting, every public appearance had to be choreographed to hide the arm that hung uselessly at his side. Next, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm II. From the moment of his birth, Wilhelm II, the last German emperor and king of Prussia, was destined to be a spectacle. Born in 1859 into the glittering web of European royalty, he was the first grandson of Queen Victoria and heir to the Prussian throne, the future Kaiser of a rising German empire. But behind the throne, behind the iron eagles and polished sabers, was a deeper truth. A truth that shaped not only the man, but the 20th century itself. Wilhelm II was born with a withered left arm, and he spent his entire life trying to pretend he wasn't. His birth was traumatic, literally. A breech delivery, mismanaged by doctors who pulled too hard on his left arm during extraction, resulted in permanent nerve damage, what we now recognize as Erb's palsy. The damage was immediate and irreversible. His arm never developed properly. It was shriveled, shorter than the right, largely immobile, and noticeably weaker. He could not raise it above shoulder height, could not grip with full strength. could not ride a horse with both hands or wield a sword convincingly. For a Hohenzollern prince in the age of blood and iron, this was more than inconvenient. It was catastrophic. Because Wilhelm wasn't just royalty, he was supposed to be Prussian royalty. Raised in the stern militaristic tradition of Frederick the Great, Wilhelm was taught that strength was virtue, posture was politics, and physical flaw equaled weakness. There was no space in the Prussian court for vulnerability, especially not in the future emperor. So, they began to hide it. From infancy, Wilhelm was subjected to brutal therapies. His arm was stretched, twisted, electrically stimulated. He was made to ride, fence, shoot, and perform military drills tailored to showcase his right side while masking the left. Special devices were created, iron splints, elaborate braces designed to train the arm into usefulness. None of it worked. The limb remained shriveled. But the psychological damage worked just fine. Wilhelm developed a complex that would drive the rest of his life. A frantic, desperate need to prove strength, even when it wasn't there. And it never really left him. He learned to shake hands with a crushing grip to compensate. He practiced gestures that downplayed the arm. Court photographers were instructed to position him carefully standing behind tables, with the arm hidden in capes, or holding gloves that masked its deformity. Paintings idealized him. Statues sanitized him. Uniforms were designed with stiff sleeves. Even in military parades, his gait and salutes were choreographed. The image was crafted with obsessive precision. Wilhelm the Strong, the warrior Kaiser, the Iron Monarch. But the truth was never far behind. Those closest to Wilhelm knew the real cost. His insecurities fed his vanity. His disability didn't humble him, it sharpened his pride into something brittle, combustible. He overcompensated constantly. Every conversation had to be dominated. Every challenge met with aggression. He was impulsive, defensive, and easily slighted. Psychologists today might call it narcissistic overcompensation. In his own time, people called it Wilhelm being Wilhelm. Even Queen Victoria, his grandmother and lifelong correspondent, remarked on the discrepancy. She adored him, but privately lamented his insecurity, his mood swings, his need to prove something to everyone, constantly. As he rose through the ranks of the Prussian court and German politics, Wilhelm became more than just an heir. He became a symbol of imperial Germany, bold, erratic, nationalistic. In 1888, the year of the three emperors, his father Frederick III died after only 99 days on the throne. Wilhelm, then 29, became Kaiser. It was a new Germany and a new opportunity for Wilhelm to perform the role he had been practicing his entire life. As emperor, Wilhelm ruled with the force of a man trying to outpace his own past. He threw himself into military ceremonies, wore uniforms obsessively, posed as supreme warlord of a rapidly growing empire. His speeches were bombastic, his foreign policy erratic. He dismissed his chancellor, Bismarck, an architect of German unification, in a fit of ego. He meddled constantly in diplomacy, often with disastrous results. He was not unintelligent, just emotionally volatile. And behind that volatility, always, was the arm. The silent, ever-present reminder of his weakness. The thing he could never fix, only obscure. His obsession with military imagery became a national aesthetic. Statues of him sprouted across the empire. Paintings depicted him as larger-than-life sword raised, steely-eyed. Yet in private, his moods collapsed. He brooded. He panicked. He surrounded himself with yes-men and dismissed those who challenged him. He was deeply sensitive to mockery, especially about his arm. Foreign caricatures, especially British and French ones, frequently depicted him with a shriveled limb, and he was enraged by them. The tragedy of Wilhelm II isn't just personal, it's historical. His insecurities fed his need for validation, which in turn shaped his aggressive posturing on the world stage. His hunger for recognition, for masculine authority, for imperial glory, pushed Germany toward confrontation. His support for Austria-Hungary in 1914, his blank check guarantee, and his inability to contain the escalating tensions of Europe helped plunge the continent into World War I. And when the war turned against Germany, Wilhelm's image so carefully cultivated crumbled. By 1918, the war was lost. Revolution broke out in Berlin. Wilhelm abdicated and fled to exile in the Netherlands. The Iron Kaiser, who had once marched with troops and shaken hands with emperors, now lived in a Dutch manor, feeding ducks and reading war memoirs. He died in 1941, under the shadow of a Second World War he had helped make possible. In the end, Wilhelm was a man shaped by a single, silent flaw. His left arm didn't just hang at his side, it haunted every gesture, every word, every political decision. He couldn't lift a sword with both hands, so he ruled with his mouth. He couldn't match the image of the perfect Prussian warrior, so he invented one and forced the world to believe it. But history doesn't remember the sleeve, it remembers the tremble behind it. And while Wilhelm's deformity was buried in silk and steel, the next monarch made no attempt to hide his disorder. He couldn't. His reign was filled with episodes loud, public, dangerous, and his mental illness shook an entire court into a state of polite panic. Next, Christian VII of Denmark, Norway. Christian VII of Denmark, Norway. Some kings reigned with swords, others with words. Christian VII of Denmark, Norway reigned with confusion, silence, and sudden shrieks in the dark. His court became a shadow theatre, nobles tiptoeing around outbursts, doctors prescribing dreams, and political factions governing in the vacuum left by a monarch who couldn't be trusted with a sentence, let alone a state. His reign officially from 1766 to 1808 was one of the most surreal in European history. Because while Christians sat on the throne, the question of who was really ruling changed almost monthly. Was it his stepmother, his doctor, his wife, his mistress, his half-brother? At any given point, Christian was king in name and puppet in practice, his mental illness not merely a personal burden, but a national crisis. He was born in 1749, the only surviving son of King Frederick V of Denmark and Louise of Great Britain, a daughter of George II. Like most royals, Christian was groomed from childhood to rule. But from early on, there were signs that something was deeply off. He was described as nervous, erratic, prone to grimacing, stammering, laughing at nothing. Tutors complained that he was inattentive, difficult to instruct, emotionally volatile. He often lashed out or withdrew completely. By adolescence, the signs had solidified into a disturbing pattern. Christian was not merely eccentric, he was mentally unwell. Today, his symptoms point towards schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with psychotic features, possibly compounded by neurodevelopmental issues or trauma. He suffered from hallucinations, paranoia, severe mood swings, tics, and obsessive behaviors. He was prone to long periods of listlessness followed by manic energy, during which he would act out violently or engage in bizarre rituals. But there was no diagnosis in the 18th century, only fear. When Christian became king at the age of 17, the court tried to stage manage him. His council hoped the marriage would stabilize him. He was quickly wed to his 5-year-old cousin, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, his own cousin, because of course, and while the wedding ceremony was impressive, the marriage was anything but. Christian reportedly ignored his wife from the start. He spent more time with prostitutes and drunken companions than with his queen. He was erratic and cruel. He mocked her in front of the court, publicly humiliated her. He walked through the palace in rags or sometimes completely nude. He mutilated himself. He struck servants without warning. He often babbled incoherently during council meetings. On some nights, he was said to bark like a dog. This was not eccentricity. This was full-blown psychiatric collapse happening inside a palace, gilded with candles and crowned with diplomatic expectations. The nobility was horrified. But they could not depose him. Not yet. The machinery of monarchy demanded that they protect the illusion, even as it became harder and harder to maintain. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee. A German physician, Struensee was brought in to manage the king in 1768. He was a man of enlightenment, ideals, rational, progressive, intellectual. He was also dangerously ambitious. At first, Struensee's effect on Christians seemed miraculous. The king calmed slightly, became more coherent. The hallucinations didn't vanish, but the rage softened. He began to sleep, eat, function, at least in a ceremonial capacity. Behind the scenes, Struensee was quietly assuming power. He became the king's personal physician, chief advisor, and eventually de facto regent. The king signed whatever he was told. In 2 years, Struensee pushed through over 1,000 reforms, abolishing torture, introducing press freedom, limiting noble privileges, reforming education and law. Enlightenment, at full speed. But this wasn't just a political story. It was also personal. Struensee was soon having an affair with Queen Caroline Matilda. It was open, scandalous, and known by everyone except Christian himself, or perhaps even him, depending on the day. They paraded around the court, rode horseback together, smiled in portraits. The queen became pregnant. The child Princess Louise Augusta was widely rumored to be Struensee's princess, and still, Christian did nothing. Whether he didn't know or didn't care is still debated. What's clear is that he no longer ruled in any meaningful sense. Denmark was now a kingdom ruled by a physician, a queen, and a mad king tucked behind silken curtains. But reform has enemies. In 1772, conservative forces struck back. A palace coup engineered by the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria and other nobles ended Struensee's regime violently. He was arrested, tortured, and executed. Caroline Matilda was exiled. Their child was taken from her. And Christian? He barely noticed, or if he did, he could not express it. He was left behind in the capital, now firmly under his stepmother's control. His guardians dressed him, fed him, and presented him on ceremonial occasions. He was no longer a man. He was a wax figure in a crown, occasionally lucid, often muttering, always observed. He would remain that way for over 3 decades. For the rest of his life, Christian lived in a strange limbo, technically king, but functionally invisible. When he died in 1808, he had reigned for 42 years, longer than most of his predecessors. But ask a Dane what Christian VII did during his reign, and they'll tell you what he didn't. Govern, lead, speak clearly, understand. His reign was not one of policy, but of pathology. It exposed the raw limitations of monarchy, the illusion that royal blood guaranteed stability. Christian was living proof that a crown could sit on a mind in fragments. His body was not twisted, his speech not silenced by injury, but his mind had unraveled into something ungovernable. In Christian VII, Denmark had a monarch so extreme in dysfunction that he became a national ghost, seen but not heard, known but never understood. His reign was a whispered secret written in elegant script, signed by hands not his own. And where Christian's madness was cloaked in velvet, the next king's disease was quite literal: decay, limb by limb. A monarch whose flesh turned white, then numb, then dead, until the gloves came off, and history could no longer ignore what was rotting beneath. Next, Baldwin IV, the leper. Baldwin IV, the leper. The kingdom of Jerusalem wasn't built to last. It was born out of bloodshed crusader steel hammered into thrones atop conquered sand. A Christian state carved into Muslim land, reliant on zeal, alliances, and fragile dynastic glue. And then, against every imaginable odd, the Holy Land got a teenage king whose body was literally disintegrating. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem reigned from 1174 to 1185. History remembers him as the Leper King. That nickname wasn't a slur, it was a fact. Baldwin ruled a crusader kingdom while infected with one of the most stigmatized, misunderstood diseases of the medieval world. And not from afar, he rode into battle, led councils, outmaneuvered enemies while his nerves died, his skin cracked, and his extremities slowly turned to stone. Leprosy. Even today, the word carries weight, but in the 12th century, it was divine judgment made flesh, a visible mark of sin. The disease itself, known today as Hansen's disease, is caused by Mycobacterium leprae, a slow-acting bacteria that attacks the nerves, skin, and mucous membranes. In Baldwin's time, the effects were horrifying. Numbness, ulcers, blindness, clawed hands, loss of fingers and toes. The body didn't just rot, it forgot how to feel, how to move, how to heal. And yet, somehow, Baldwin IV ruled anyway. He was born in 1161, the only son of Amalric I, King of Jerusalem. As a child, Baldwin was active and intelligent, but around the age of 9, something strange happened. He injured his arm during rough play and didn't feel it. That numbness was a sign. His tutor, the famed historian and cleric William of Tyre, was the first to suspect the truth. The young prince had leprosy. Normally, that would have ended any royal career before it began, but Jerusalem in the 12th century didn't have that luxury. Succession was thin. Amalric had no other sons. So, when he died in 1174, 13-year-old Baldwin inherited the throne, diseased, yes, but crowned just the same. He was immediately cloaked in ceremony. To stabilize the fragile kingdom, a regency was established under Count Raymond III of Tripoli. Meanwhile, Baldwin began learning to rule a teenager now aware of the condition inside him and of the doom that awaited. Most lepers were exiled from society, sent to colonies or monasteries. But Baldwin was king. He had to lead despite the whispers, the growing disfigurement, the chronic fatigue, and the looming reality that his reign would end far too early. But here's where Baldwin's story sharpens. He didn't rule passively. By 1176, just 2 years after his coronation, Baldwin took up full kingship. He dismissed the regent and began asserting real political authority. He surrounded himself with a web of powerful barons, married off his sisters strategically, and began preparing for war. Yes, war. Baldwin IV wasn't a cloistered figurehead. He rode out personally against Muslim forces, particularly the rising power of Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. In 1177, still just 16, Baldwin led the Christian forces in the Battle of Montgisard, and it wasn't a symbolic presence, he was at the front lines. Despite his worsening condition, his hands beginning to claw, his face pale and cracked, he commanded the army with skill and fury. Outnumbered by Saladin's forces nearly 5-1, the Kingdom of Jerusalem achieved a miraculous victory. The teenager in agony became a hero, a symbol, a myth in real time. Of course, myth has a cost. Behind the victories, Baldwin's health was crumbling. He wore gloves to cover lesions, walked with assistance, began losing vision in one eye. His fingers began to curl. He could no longer use cutlery properly. He was often carried rather than walked, but still he ruled. The court became a fortress of silence around him. No one dared speak of his condition openly. Ceremonies continued as if his limbs weren't withering. Letters were signed, decisions made. But the unspoken truth, everyone knew it. Baldwin IV was dying slowly and ruling fiercely. He knew he would never produce an heir, so succession became an obsession. His sister, Sibylla, was married off to William of Montferrat, who died shortly after. She then married Guy of Lusignan, a man Baldwin never trusted. He feared Guy was weak, power-hungry, and politically inept. Baldwin, even as his fingers fell numb, tried to block Guy from inheriting the throne. He named Sibylla's son by her first husband, Baldwin V, as co-king. That's how desperate things had become. A boy with leprosy appointing a child to rule alongside him to prevent a disaster he saw coming. It worked, for a while. But the disease was winning. By 1183, Baldwin could no longer ride. His face was disfigured. He suffered from chronic infections, skin ulcerations, partial blindness, and what must have been unimaginable pain. And still he ruled. He ordered campaigns. He negotiated with Saladin. He passed reforms. All while being physically carried to council meetings, wrapped in layers of silk and linen to hide the decay beneath. The court charade continued until it couldn't. Baldwin IV died in 1185 at the age of 24. His reign had lasted 11 years longer than many expected, longer than his doctors believed possible. His death marked more than the end of a reign. It was the beginning of Jerusalem's end. His successor, the child Baldwin V, died soon after. Guy of Lusignan seized power, leading the kingdom into disaster. In 1187, Saladin captured Jerusalem. Baldwin IV had held the line with a dying body, a disintegrating nervous system, and a kingdom made of sand. And that's the extremity. He was a leper, in a time when that meant exile, shame, and silence. And instead, he became a warrior king, a political force, a man whose body failed, but whose will never did. Every sword he lifted, every order he gave, was in defiance not just of Saladin, but of his own biology. Baldwin's reign is a study in endurance, not triumphant, but tragic, not miraculous, but brutally human. His disability didn't define him, it tried to erase him, and he refused. But while Baldwin wore gloves to conceal what was disappearing, the next emperor on our list had no such luxury. His deformity was inflicted not by illness, but by enemies. And when his nose was cut off and his face turned to ruin, he responded not with shame, but with gold. Next, Justinian II, Rhinote Metos. Justinian II, Rhinote Metos. Imagine being so hated, so violently rejected by your own empire, that when they finally caught you, they didn't just exile you, they disfigured you, mutilated you, made you unrecognizable. And then, just when they were certain you'd vanish from history, you came back, crowned again. Crowned twice, actually. That was the legacy of Justinian II of Byzantium. Nicknamed Rhinote Metos, which translates directly to the slit-nosed Justinian, didn't just suffer a brutal deformity, he turned it into a political weapon. A gilded, golden nose, forged not to hide shame, but to spite it. This is not just the story of a disfigured emperor. It's the story of a man who clawed his way back to power with half a face, and then ruled like someone who knew exactly what it cost to wear a crown. Let's rewind. Justinian II was born around 668 CE, the son of Constantine IV, and part of the Heraclean dynasty, a line of emperors stretching back to the early 7th century. He was crowned co-emperor as a child. A common practice in Byzantium meant to ensure dynastic continuity. When his father died in 685, Justinian ascended the throne at the age of 16. Young, ambitious, and fiercely intelligent, Justinian took power with an intensity that rattled the aristocracy. He was religious to the point of zealotry, politically aggressive, and economically heavy-handed. His first reign was marked by a flurry of reform, both civil and military, but also by a sharp turn toward autocracy. He cracked down on corruption, taxed heavily, redistributed land, and centralized authority. None of that made him popular. Justinian lacked the delicate balance that Byzantine rulers needed: the ability to play the Senate, the army, the church, and the people against each other just enough to stay in power. Instead, he alienated everyone all at once. By 695, a full revolt had erupted in Constantinople. The army mutinied. The populace rioted. The Senate moved to depose him. But they didn't stop there. When the mob seized Justinian, they didn't merely exile him, they mutilated him. His nose was slit, cut off, or severely damaged, depending on the account. In the Byzantine world, physical perfection was deeply tied to imperial legitimacy. A mutilated body was considered unfit to rule. By disfiguring Justinian, his enemies believed they were permanently disqualifying him. You could exile a man and he might come back, but disfigure him? You were erasing him from the idea of kingship itself. It was symbolic, surgical, political violence with religious undertones. After the mutilation, Justinian was sent into exile in Cherson, a remote city in the Crimea. He lived there for years, watched, underestimated, and slowly burning with rage. This wasn't a man broken by trauma. This was a man biding his time. And then he did the unthinkable. He escaped. He rallied allies, most notably the Bulgar Khan Tervel, and returned to Byzantium with a small army in 705. The city was taken in a stunning coup. Justinian re-entered Constantinople by night, through a secret passage in the city's massive Theodosian walls. When dawn broke, he was emperor again. The court was stunned. The people were terrified. This was not the same Justinian. He returned with a face transformed, reportedly wearing a golden prosthetic nose crafted to replace what had been cut away. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't cosmetic. It was a statement. The emperor was back, and he had gilded his mutilation. That's what made Justinian II so extreme. He didn't hide his deformity. He elevated it. He made it part of his mythos, a ruler who had been flayed and returned in gold. Byzantine iconography, which had previously idealized emperors with youthful, symmetrical features, now had to reckon with a monarch who bore the mark of vengeance on his face. But with the comeback came the cruelty. Justinian's second reign, from 705 to 711, was defined by revenge. He unleashed purges on those who had deposed him, mutilated senators, and executed rivals. He ruled with a mixture of paranoia and fury. Diplomatically, he launched aggressive military campaigns, trying to restore Byzantine influence across the Balkans and Asia Minor. Some were successful. Many were not. His enemies feared him more than ever, but they also waited. In 711, another revolt rose, this time led by a general named Philippicus. Justinian, caught off guard and betrayed by his own troops, was captured. No exile this time. He was executed, along with his 6-year-old son Tiberius. who had also been crowned co-emperor. The Heraclean dynasty ended with blood on the floor, and yet Justinian II left a legacy, unlike any other emperor, before or after. In a world that equated physical deformity with divine disfavor, Justinian ripped that logic apart. He proved that power didn't need a perfect face. That legitimacy could be reclaimed not just through politics, but through spectacle. His golden nose wasn't a prosthetic, it was propaganda, a portable icon, a reminder that the empire had tried to erase him and failed. Where others ruled with robes and crowns, Justinian ruled with his wound. He made trauma imperial, made disfigurement imperial, made pain part of the costume. His story isn't inspirational, it's terrifying. This wasn't resilience, this was obsession. The need to return not to heal, but to dominate. Because that's the cost of deformity in the palace. You're either buried by it, or you build your throne out of it. And while Justinian wore his wound like a medallion, the next emperor on our list wouldn't get that chance. His disability wasn't symbolic, it was functional. Final. When his eyes were taken, so was his empire. And history nearly forgot he ever existed. Next, Constantine VI. Constantine VI. Byzantium was a land of contradictions where theology became policy, emperors became monks, and a mother could blind her own son in the name of Christ, order, or just raw political power. Constantine VI, the last emperor of the Isaurian dynasty, lived and died in that brutal logic. He was crowned a child, ruled as a ghost, and lost his throne and his sight to his mother. Not to battle, not to foreign invasion, but to a palace coup with holy justifications and knives drawn under veils of incense. Born in 771, Constantine VI was the only son of Emperor Leo IV and Irene of Athens, a woman who would go on to become one of the most powerful and controversial figures in Byzantine history. At age 5, Constantine was crowned co-emperor. At age 9, his father died. And just like that, the Roman Empire in the East was in the hands of a boy and his mother. For the first decade of his reign, Constantine was a boy in a golden cage. Irene ruled as regent, wielding imperial power from behind the curtain. And she wasn't merely filling the role temporarily, she was expanding it, asserting authority more aggressively than many male rulers before her. A devout iconophile during the bitter age of iconoclasm, she reversed policies of her husband and predecessors, restoring the veneration of icons and convening the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. But her son, growing older and more aware, began to chafe under her control. By the time Constantine turned 16, he wanted to rule in name, and in fact, tensions mounted. Irene clung to power, and the courts divided into two camps, those loyal to the Empress Regent and those who supported the young emperor. Factions schemed, intrigues brewed. In 790, Constantine made his move. With support from military leaders, especially in the Armeniac theme, one of the powerful provincial armies, he staged a coup. Irene was stripped of power and confined to the palace. For a brief moment, Constantine VI ruled alone. And almost immediately, everything fell apart. He was young, inexperienced, and paranoid. His decisions were inconsistent. He exiled trusted advisors, then recalled them. He made enemies in the church and failed to maintain support among the military. His biggest political blunder came in 795 when he divorced his first wife Maria of Amnia and married his mistress Theodot, a move that enraged the church and sparked what's now called the Moakian controversy. Clergy protested, monks revolted, public confidence eroded. Constantine already seen as weak, now looked dangerously unstable, and the court began to whisper again. Maybe Irene had been right. Meanwhile, she waited. In 792, Constantine had made a critical mistake. He reinstated Irene as co-emperor, likely in a misguided attempt to pacify internal factions, but that gave her legitimacy, a title, a foothold. Slowly, she rebuilt her network of loyalists. Then came the collapse. In 797, with Constantine isolated and unpopular, Irene struck. Her palace faction staged a quiet, efficient coup. Constantine was seized, imprisoned, and most notoriously blinded. It wasn't just a brutal gesture. In Byzantine law and culture, a blind man could not be emperor. Physical wholeness was considered a reflection of divine favor. Blinding was the political erasure of a person. And this wasn't a discrete punishment. According to some sources, the blinding was so violent that Constantine may have died shortly after from the wounds, or from shock. Others claim he lived for several more years, imprisoned, mutilated, and forgotten. But he was gone, in every way that mattered. Irene was now sole ruler of Byzantium, the first woman to rule the Roman Empire in her own right. She didn't rule as a regent or as a consort, she ruled as Basileus, the male form of emperor, not Basilissa. Her face appeared on coins, her name in decrees, but her path to power was carved in the eyes of her son. And that's where Constantine VI's legacy becomes so grotesquely extreme. Because his deformity wasn't congenital. It wasn't the result of illness. It was political mutilation, an intentional act of dehumanization by the person who had once held him as a child. He was blinded not because he posed a military threat, but because he might have been seen as emperor again. And in the theater of Byzantine politics, that possibility had to be extinguished entirely. The empire never spoke his name again. His portraits were destroyed. His reign was erased from official records where possible. He was a king made into a ghost, both literally and figuratively, a symbol of the brutal calculus of Byzantine rule. Better a blinded son than a divided empire. And perhaps the most disturbing part? Irene wasn't condemned. She ruled for 5 more years. She negotiated with Charlemagne. She governed with stability. It wasn't until 802 that she was deposed herself by a court tired of the scandal, the gender controversy, and the lingering unease that came from remembering how she got the throne in the first place. Constantine VI's story is extreme not because of what he did, but because of what was done to him. He was a puppet king, briefly self-aware, then crushed the moment he moved to pull his own strings. His blinding wasn't just an act of political surgery. It was a message to every noble, general, and courtier. Legitimacy is a knife edge, and one wrong step can leave you unable to see forever. In the halls of Byzantium, golden and brutal, there was no space for weakness, and no room for the half-sighted. But if Constantine was blinded to keep him from ruling, the next monarch on our list descended into darkness from within. His eyes worked just fine. His mind? That was another story. Madness didn't strike him all at once, it came in waves. Long, catastrophic waves that threatened to drown an empire. Next, Philip V of Spain. Philip V of Spain. The Bourbon dynasty arrived in Spain trailing glory, grandeur, and the guillotine edge of French absolutism. But when Philip V became the first Bourbon king of Spain in 1700, what came with him wasn't just Versailles fashion and centralization reforms, it was something darker, something more internal. A mind like a cracked mirror, reflecting bursts of manic ambition, followed by endless corridors of despair. Philip V didn't just rule Spain, he unraveled inside it. Over the course of his long, turbulent reign, the king oscillated between moments of strategic brilliance and paralyzing psychological collapse. He wasn't merely a melancholic figure or a moody monarch. He was a sovereign drowning in depression, gripped by obsessive fears, manic insomnia, and episodes of profound detachment from reality. And he ruled for nearly 46 years. Born in 1683 at Versailles, Philip was the second son of the Grand Dauphin of France and the grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. He wasn't supposed to be a king of France or anywhere else. But in 1700, the childless Charles II of Spain died, leaving a crumbling empire and no heir. His will named Philip as successor. With this, the Spanish Habsburg line ended and the Bourbon dynasty began. It also triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a full-blown continental conflict that turned Europe into a chessboard soaked in gunpowder. But while armies clashed and diplomats schemed, young Philip, barely 17, took the throne in Madrid. He was inexperienced, shy, and visibly uncomfortable in public. Almost immediately, the signs of instability began to emerge. He hated travel, hated crowds, hated ceremony. He spoke little in court, and when he did, his words were often mumbled or incoherent. He had difficulty sleeping, sometimes going days without rest. He was often confused, paranoid, and obsessed with ritual cleanliness. His attendants reported long stretches of catatonia, during which the king would stare into space, unresponsive, as if locked in some inner echo chamber. But he could also swing in the opposite direction. In his manic phases, Philip was compulsively energetic pacing, writing letters through the night, issuing commands, then reversing them the next day. He would leap into military affairs with erratic enthusiasm, make impulsive diplomatic moves, then vanish from court for weeks, unable to face even his ministers. It wasn't just eccentricity, it was madness, visible and escalating. During the War of the Spanish Succession, 1714, Spain was being dismembered from all sides. Philip, despite his mental fragility, held on, partly due to French military support, partly due to the loyalty of some Spanish factions, and, partly ironically, because his unpredictable mind made him impossible to manipulate entirely. After the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Philip retained the Spanish crown, but had to cede much of Spain's European territory. Italy, the Netherlands, and other holdings were carved away. What was left was a broken, exhausted empire, and a broken, exhausted king. Then things got stranger. In 1724, Philip suddenly abdicated in favor of his 6-year-old son, Louis I. He cited exhaustion and religious devotion. In truth, he may have been spiraling so badly he no longer felt capable of functioning. For a brief moment, Spain had a new king, and Philip retired to San Ildefonso Palace, muttering prayers, wrapped in obsessive rituals. But Louis died just 7 months later of smallpox, and Philip, barely stable, was forced back onto the throne. This is where the madness bloomed fully. Philip became deeply reclusive. His rituals grew more elaborate. He refused to change clothes for days. He feared being poisoned. He often demanded that his bedding, furniture, and food be handled in exact sequences. He suffered from echolalia, repeating the same words, phrases, or prayers for hours. He believed voices spoke to him through walls. At night, he screamed. Sleep? It was a battlefield. Insomnia gripped him, but it wasn't just restlessness. Philip was terrified of falling asleep. He believed demons came to him in dreams. Sometimes he insisted on being touched constantly to prove he was alive. He required servants to sit by his bed and read to him until dawn. He refused to be alone for more than a few minutes at a time. And then, as always, there were the revivals. Intermittently, Philip's mind would stabilize. He'd summon ministers, make sound decisions, reorganize the navy or the tax code, but it never lasted. His depression always returned. Like a tide, it receded only to flood back stronger. His second wife, Elizabeth Farnese of Parma, became the de facto power behind the throne. Intelligent and politically shrewd, she managed foreign policy, arranged dynastic marriages, and kept the state functioning while Philip fell deeper into his internal abyss. She walked a tightrope, maintaining her husband's image while shielding the kingdom from his instability. The courtiers learned to read the signs. If the king emerged, dressed and alert, it would be a day of policy. If he was still in his nightgown at noon, muttering to himself, they waited. His children feared him. His ministers pitied him. His doctors couldn't help him. And the people of Spain? They never truly knew how sick their king was. Because Philip, for all his unraveling, remained the image of divine monarchy. Portraits still depicted him as stern and regal. Edicts still bore his name. But inside the palace, reality fractured. When Philip finally died in 1746, after nearly 5 decades of reign, excluding that brief abdication, his legacy was complex. He had founded a new dynasty, presided over wars and reforms, stabilized the monarchy after the chaotic Habsburg collapse. But he also brought to the throne a mental illness so severe, so cyclical, and so overwhelming, it nearly unseated the idea of monarchy itself. Philip's disability was hidden behind brocade and candlelight, but it wasn't invisible. It whispered from behind the throne, scribbled across midnight letters, and echoed through silent, sleepless corridors. He wasn't mad in the Shakespearean, operatic sense. He was mad in the slow, grinding, private way that wears down empires one sleepless night at a time.